I'm going to go ahead and call us to order for the City Council regular meeting for Tuesday, July 2nd, 2019. Madam City Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Mayor Christy Malchow.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Karen Moran.
Present.
Councilmember Tom Hornish. Present. Councilmember Jason Ritchie.
Present.
Councilmember Chris Ross. Present. Councilmember Pamela Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Ramiro Valderrama.
Present.
Okay, Madam City Clerk, we do have a quorum. Councilmember Ritchie, would you please lead us in the pledge?
Sure.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I'd entertain a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Any comment? Nope, seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, the agenda is approved. Next, we'll have public comment. This is an opportunity for the public to address the council, 3-minute limit per person, or 5 minutes if representing the official position of a recognized community organization. If you would like to show video or PowerPoint, it must be submitted or emailed by 5 p.m. end of business day to Melanie Anderson, our city clerk, at manderson@sammamish.us. Apparently, I need another cup of coffee. Please be aware that council meetings are videotaped and available to the public. Do we have a sign-in sheet?
No.
No? Okay. Would anyone like to address the council this evening?
Good evening, Council. Sharon Steinbus, 24933 Southeast 14th Street. I don't mean to be lecturing you. I know you have a lot on your plate and you're doing the best you can. The city cannot continue to ignore code regulations. Traffic problems and stormwater problems are not going to go away. Stormwater equals rainwater, which doesn't just fall on the roads, it rains on the entire plateau. According to Cliff Moss, professor of meteorology at the University of Washington, in a June 24, 2019 blog post titled, "The Best Estimate Yet of the Impact of Global Warming on the Pacific Northwest," the Northwest will not dry out under global warming. We will generally get wetter. The city has an obligation to reduce the risk to life and property due to stormwater runoff. Stormwater is increased with development use due to impervious surfaces. By developing, the city is increasing stormwater runoff by 20 to 30%. The city is responsible for development, for stormwater runoff, and also responsible for any possible damage it may cause. Stormwater runoff problems must be fixed now, or the city may have to later pay to fix such serious problems as landslides involving damage to people and property. The city must deal with the cumulative impact of growth. As the old adage says, a stitch in time saves 9. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to address the council this evening?
Karen Herring, 23684 Southeast 32nd Way. I'm going to have to read my notes. One of the first ordinances adopted when our city incorporated was related to drainage as enforceable surface water management regulations necessary to preserve peace and health and welfare. When properties are being flooded, this is not peaceful, this is not healthy, and it's really costly. I know this. Safety is key and should always be first priority. On interlogical agreement with King County for surface water services, the city is legally responsible for surface water management and drainage services and financing them by service charge on developed properties. On GMA planning goals that the city of Sammamish must use, adequate public facilities and services include drainage for surface and stormwater runoff, Where the city of Sammamish is allowing growth and approving permits, there must be proper stormwater management, or just don't allow that growth. The Department of Commerce, GMI, requires cities to designate and protect critical areas, including geologic hazards where there are landslide areas, steep slopes, erosion and seismic hazards, or flooding. Protecting these critical areas helps reduce exposure to risks such as landslides or flooding. All critical areas must be designated and protected using best available science. It can be costly or even impossible, and probably it's impossible, to replace critical area functions and values once they're lost. The Growth Management Hearing Board views that the GMA establishes 2 categories of critical areas. I think you got copies of all this, so I'm not going to read those. The city must protect landslide and steep slope areas, erosion hazards, by properly designating them and reducing threats and risks. I understand the Inglewood Historic Neighborhood has multiple hazard areas, and Tamarack experiences both flooding and landslides. You've heard me come to speak on stormwater for wildlife, streams, fish, and protecting the environment. But flooding in landslide or erosion hazard areas is risky. It's too risky, especially near steep slopes. The 2015 Comp Plan for the Environment and Conservation states under a goal EC2, protect people, property, and the environment in areas of natural hazards. As y'all discuss and consider stormwater issues tonight or forever, remember safety first, because people and property count too. And so do our little red fish. You know, those are my thing.
Thank you.
My name's Mary Wichter, and I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. So I live in Tamarack, but there's no monument, sign, or headstone. Tamarack was just platted by the King County assessor so they could make sure they get their taxes, and we've paid those in deed. The city of Sammamish sets and collects all stormwater fees and annual taxes to fund projects, and Tamarack owners have paid over $600,000 in required stormwater fees and system development charges that must be used to do stormwater projects. In 2018 alone, Tamarack owners also pay over $200,000 in taxes just in 1 year to the city of Sammamish. However, there is no public stormwater facility in Tamarack, so the city carries no burden. What's missing from the city's action and information for tonight are the following. Tamarack was 60% developed of the 210 lots shown here by the county through the year 2000. This was done without drainage issues. The city of Sammamish has permitted 40 new homes, those are the yellow squares, between 2000 and 2018. So we are now 80% developed, but there are still 40 vacant lots remaining. Those are the red circled boxes. And the city continues to permit new homes. Though numerous complaints have been made and multiple studies done, the city has identified fixes, but no improvements have been done. There should be a moratorium on building and expansions until drainage improvements are implemented. The Zaku's Basin Plan did identify Tamarack Tightline as a top project for 65 points, but then it pushed it aside. The city is reluctant to fund or act, saying it's a private area, but they're allowing growth during permits. Tamarack roads are not the problem. The roads have ditches and they convey stormwater. There's also infiltrative soils, but those are getting saturated because the excess runoff from development sends too much water too fast for too long a duration. The ditches and culverts are overrun with fast erosive flows and the infiltrative soils are saturated. This causes flooding. It also picks up pollutants with overflows that head to Zaku's Creek. And that happens right here. And there's also overflows that happen more than 1,000 feet below Tamarack, which also help flood the parkway. In 2017, the city also chose to use, until 2017, the city chose to use old code. And that means this area wasn't designated as a landslide hazard because you didn't map it, and you could build 5,000 square feet instead of just 2,000 without a drainage review. And then you can see here, there's been a lot of development here and here, but there's been nothing to address those problems. Also missing from the facts is that Tamarack has a landslide hazard drainage area running through it north-south. It's this way, but I'm holding it this way for downhill. The Growth Management Act requires that the city must identify and designate critical areas and protect them. Tamarack is a single location in the city that didn't have a drains to area, and that was added finally. The city did correct it, and the Growth Management Hearings Board says there's 2 categories of critical areas. Areas whose functions and values are protected by beneficial services like wetlands, aquifer recharge, and probably streams. But you also need to do areas where protection is needed due to the threat that is posed to persons and property. That's frequently flooded geographic areas. So I hope that the city understands they've had their hand in the mix all the way. There is no way for us to fix this problem, and you've been part of it all along. So please consider that as you do your discussion.
Thank you. Is there anyone that would like to address council?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Mary, how many of the lots were developed while it was King County, and how many was city?
So there's about 210 lots total. We were
Okay.
60% developed, so it was like 125 under King County.
Okay.
And there were not drainage problems. Eric LaFrance, who was Tawny's predecessor, came out and said, hey, there's never been water down here in 2000, right when I bought my home. And then 40 homes have been added. It's actually 40 to 45 because there's some getting
With the
worked
city,
on right
all right.
now. And that's 80% developed. And the problem is we still have another 20% to go. You guys know there's problems, nothing's getting done, and we're really to the point you're going to have risks and landslide hazards in the areas with the people at the bottom, and we don't own all the
Got it.
roads
All right,
together.
thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. City Manager, apparently, Councilmember Ritchie just alerted me that someone has told him that we are not broadcasting. You're aware of it?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was just going to let you know that we're having difficulty with our third-party vendor that streams it.
Gotcha.
Their website's down, so we're working on it.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, anyone else that would like to address council this evening? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to our consent calendar. I'd entertain a motion.
I'd like to remove,
Okay, Councilmember
I'd like
Ronish.
to remove number 8 for the minutes.
Okay,
I'd like to remove numbers 4, 5, and 7.
4, 5, and 7. Okay. So then I would entertain a motion for approval of the consent calendar as amended.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, the consent calendar as amended is approved. We will tuck items 4, 5, 7, and 8 after item 9, which is our next item. With that, we will move on to item 9, which is a discussion on stormwater code amendments. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and Council. At this time, I will turn it over to our wonderful staff for presentation.
Good evening, Council, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Mr. City Manager, Cheryl Paston, Public Works. You certainly don't need me to introduce Tawny, but I did want to take this opportunity, as many of you know, she is leaving us after about 14 years, right? She's taking a really, really great opportunity. Actually, my boss that brought me to Sammamish is now the city manager, as many of you know, of Maple Valley, and she recruited Tawny. Tawny will do a great job. We will miss her tremendously. She's made such a big difference in the city, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge all of her hard work. She's just incredibly dedicated and has done many things that oftentimes flies underneath the radar because she's just out there developing very strong relationships with a variety of partners to not only get our capital projects done, but certainly all of the requirements, and there are many of them, for our NPDES stormwater permit. So we will miss her. I just, again, wanted to give her a bunch of kudos publicly. This will be her... This will be her last time in front of you formally. So she has, as you know, the stormwater code amendments, and then her staff will join her to talk about the public responsibilities to resolve private drainage issues following this presentation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tani.
Very good.
Wow, thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate those kind words. And I will just say that I will miss this city dearly and the many dedicated people that I've worked with over these years. So I will move on to stormwater code updates. Thank you for having these code amendments back to City Council. When last I met with you, March 5th, you provided me with some much needed direction on the stormwater code amendments related to critical drainage areas. I've taken that direction and provided draft code amendments for presentation this evening. And I did want to make some comment to the public. I think that there's been a little bit of misunderstanding about these stormwater code amendments that have been going around. They're not a weakening of the existing stormwater codes. Under exemptions and exceptions to the core requirements, the existing code does allow the director to allow certain permits to be exempt from these codes. What the draft code amendments tonight, presented tonight, will do will be to clarify when the director would be able to allow those certain exemptions or exceptions so that it's transparent to the city council, it's transparent to city planners, transparent to applicants, and most importantly, transparent to the public. So with that, I'll move on to the draft code amendments. And tonight what I'll do is, first I'll update you on what I've done since we last met, which included some stakeholder involvement meetings. I'm going to provide some highlights of the stormwater code and then some project examples, and then finally fill you in on the next steps for code adoption. What I'd really like as an outcome tonight would be for council to provide me feedback on these draft stormwater codes so that we can finalize them. As you may be aware, this is, I don't know how many times I've been here to present, but a number of times, and I'm hoping that we will be able to finalize these code amendments this evening. So after we last presented to council in March, I organized a group of a dozen participants who helped me review a draft set of code amendments. And they included property owners here in the city, development review engineers, represented from master builders, and also actually the city engineer from the city of Mercer Island, who happens to live in Sammamish. These folks reviewed the draft code that I put together a second time after we discussed, and really helped me fine-tune the specific language. On the stormwater code highlights, I'm going to talk about the definitions, slight modifications on those, how I revised the thresholds for drainage review, how I provided bifurcated critical drainage areas, the specific conditions for tightline exemptions and flow control and water quality treatment exemptions, and then finally, a discussion on reasonable use exceptions. So first, what was done, and you can find these draft codes in your Exhibit 2 of the packet. I moved the definitions for critical drainage areas and landslide hazard areas from 21A, which is the development code, to Title 13, which is the surface water code. And then council asked me to clarify the definition that landslide hazard drainage areas also included landslide hazard areas, which I've done, and also provided you an exhibit that shows the map of all the critical drainage areas. The thresholds for drainage and critical drainage areas, I added 2 primary conditions. So drainage review would be required when a new single-family dwelling unit or an accessory dwelling unit or multifamily commercial facility was proposed. And then on council direction as well, drainage review would be required when there was a net increase in impervious area of 500 square feet or more. And then this third bullet item was from public feedback regarding clearing and grading in these critical drainage areas. And so I added a 2,000 square foot threshold that would also trigger drainage review in these critical drainage areas. And then the last bullet, council asked that staff consider adding a impervious surface area by percentage of lot. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through an example. I'd like council to reconsider that request, and as we go through the examples, it'll become clear. Council also asked that there was a bifurcation of the critical drainage areas into two separate categories. One was areas that drain to areas that are landslide hazard drainage areas, and then areas that drain to Pine and Beaver Lakes. And what we did was we imposed a maximum impervious surface to those areas in landslide hazard drainage areas so that you couldn't, year after year, add more and more impervious surface. So a maximum threshold of 35% was set for those areas. And then for the areas that drain to Pine and Beaver Lake, those maximum impervious areas would be set by the current SMC 21A development code. And in those areas, we would require that low impact development techniques be used to the maximum extent feasible. On the tightline exception conditions, we required that if we allowed an exemption, a discharge would have to be identified to an acceptable discharge location. And that's where stormwater would not flood downstream properties. They wouldn't increase landslides or severe erosion. They wouldn't discharge to streams of 15% gradient or more. And also they wouldn't discharge upstream of a septic drain field or a septic drain field reserve as measured within a 100-foot radius above, below, and beside. So some examples of acceptable discharge locations are a ditch and culvert system, which provides that conveyance away from impacts to private property or infrastructure. And then another example would be where a geotech would show, and it would be peer reviewed by the city, that the cumulative effects of such a discharge wouldn't increase the risk of landslides or severe erosion. And I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. For the exemptions for flow control and water quality treatment, we indicated that if significant trees were damaged or would require removal, or siting these facilities would result in some other significant increased risk to landslide hazard area, or it's just not feasible given the modeling techniques that are accepted today, those criteria would allow the Public Works Director to grant an exemption to providing formal flow control facilities or water quality facilities on any single family lot. Either way, I guess.
If you have a question.
Yeah.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, so for these, how did the exemptions from the previous, for the tightline exemption, and then like these exemptions, how do they play together, right? So I'm just thinking about, right, where we say, you know, we don't want to require the flow control if it's going to, you know, increase these risks, et cetera. But then how does that play with a tightline exemption as well? Like,
So there
or are
are
they mutually exclusive?
There are three different core requirements that we're talking about. The first one is core requirement number 1, which specifically speaks to a tightline.
Right.
And then there's core requirement number 3, which speaks to flow control, and then number 8 that speaks to water quality. And so each of those would be considered separately.
Okay. And they don't, as you consider them separately, they don't somehow create a situation where by adhering to one thing, I bump up into the other one in any way. Does that make sense?
It does, but no, I can't think of an
Okay.
example in which it would.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. So I'll move on to just the reasonable use exceptions. So in all cases, there are going to be those examples where the existing code can't address the site-specific issue. And in that case, we have a reasonable use exception ability to review this with the city attorney, with the Department of Community Development, and make a decision on whether or not development can occur. With these, the existing code, the proposed code would require legal noticing so that everybody around would know what the city was considering. There would be a public comment period, and then once the city made a decision, and the applicant may or may not like that decision, they would have an ability to have a reconsideration. And this is consistent with how reasonable use exceptions are done with critical areas under the Development Code 21A.50. So I said I would go through some project examples. So this is an easy one. A vacant lot, a new single-family resident, proposed with the driveway, drainage review. Boom, as my son would say. Existing SFR on an existing lot. A proposed addition of 500 square feet, drainage review, yes. If you propose a patio, 500 square feet or greater, drainage review. Same thing with the deck. So you have an existing SFR and you want to put in 500 square feet. Normally that would trigger drainage review under the draft code. But let's say you want to remove 100 square feet of your driveway. So no drainage review because the net increase in impervious surface is less than 500 square feet. And that allows homeowners to really try to figure out what they want to do with their home and still meet the threshold for the 500 square feet. So land disturbance, existing vacant lot, 2,000 square feet of land clearing, drainage review. You have an existing home, you want to do some land clearing, 2,000 square feet, drainage review. And then here is an example of using the percent lot area for a drainage review threshold trigger. So the existing lot here is an R4 zoning, so 10,000 plus square feet of lot. And the city proposes a 20% trigger of impervious surface. So that would be 2178 square feet. That's the maximum impervious surface you could have on this R4 lot without triggering drainage review. Your existing house is 2,000 square feet. But you want to put in a 200 square foot addition. So existing plus proposed is 2,200 square feet. It's greater than the trigger of 2178. And so you would have drainage review under this 20% of the lot area. So just a quick review. You're proposing 200 square feet. You'd have drainage review in that. It's a small number, and from my discussion with City Council last time, that small number was significant compared to the amount of money it would take for an applicant to go through drainage review. Here's another example. The existing impervious here is 2,500 square feet, house and driveway, and this property owner wants to put in a new addition, but already the existing impervious surface is greater than the maximum allowed on the lot. So any new addition would trigger drainage review here. So bumping up the maximum impervious trigger to 25%, you could have up to 23 square feet of the lot developed with impervious surface. But here, you want to propose just 500 square feet of net impervious surface. Here, it's not going to be the percent impervious lot area that is going to trigger a drainage review. It's going to be the 500 square feet. So I tried to put a table together in your exhibits, and I think that is Exhibit 3. And it really shows you that setting a percent lot area, no matter if it's 20%, 25%, 30%, 35%, it's a very small number of square footage that would trigger drainage review. And I don't think that that was consistent with the direction that I heard from council the last time we met. And it also is given that there's a maximum impervious surface on these areas that drain to landslide hazard areas. So you could still do the small increases, incremental increases, but up to a point, and then you're done with those areas.
Can we?
I'll pause here
Okay,
to kind of let you digest this a little bit, and then ask any questions. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask some clarifying questions. So the maximum impervious surface in like the landslide hazard area or landslide hazard drainage area is what?
Under the proposed code, it would be 35%.
Is the maximum. Okay. I'm trying to marry that up with the examples you have here. So you've got it up here. I'm on a different page on my. Oop. I was reading. I can scroll to it here.
Okay.
I was looking at I'm trying to differentiate, I guess, similar to how we bifurcated the draining to Beaver Lake and Pine Lake areas. I think there's clearly a difference between the location and where you're draining, right? If you're in a sloped area in a landslide hazard area, landslide hazard drainage area, that's what I'm trying to, the differences between somebody who's on a flat parcel who's, not draining downhill to the neighbor next door in all likelihood versus, Tamarack or Inglewood, where it's a severely sloped area. No, I got to keep scrolling. Hold on. Which page number is that? Oh, here it is. Okay, I got it.
Are you talking about the bifurcated?
So I'm looking at whether or not this one is this one's bifurcated by Pine Lake and Beaver Lake and landslide hazard areas.
Yeah, there's numbers on the slides in the upper right-hand corner. If you want to tell me what number, I can go to it.
I've scrolled to your page. I was looking for your page, so I'm there. 35%. Okay, I'll keep having the wheels turn in my head while I move to the deputy mayor because she's got her light on too.
What are the numbers that are used, not just with King County, but with Issaquah in particular? Because I know they have some of the same issues that we do as far as landslide areas and that sort of thing. Do we?
I'm not aware that they have critical drainage code like we do for those areas. I know that they have maximum impervious per zoning, just as we do in 21A. But I'm not aware of any critical drainage area code that they may have.
Okay, do you know Bellevue or anybody? Okay.
No.
Okay, now I think I have my thoughts straight here. So I think as I'm thinking about bifurcating the code again here, is it possible to do something where you're creating, so we have a 35% maximum impervious surface that you can have in landslide hazard area, but is there a different trigger for drainage review in the landslide hazard or landslide hazard drainage area versus those that are not?
No, it would be the same.
But my question is, can we bifurcate the code to accommodate for those properties that are in the landslide hazard area or landslide hazard drainage area, that would trigger a drainage review prior to somebody who is not in the landslide hazard drainage area. That way we're capturing maybe some of those downhill slope effects that we're
So
having
proposing
concerns
a maximum percent impervious surface in just the areas that drain to landslide hazard areas.
So no, because you've got 35% maximum lot coverage, correct?
Yes.
So I'm not talking about max coverage. I'm talking about what triggers the drainage review. So here we had 20% originally, and then there's the thought maybe we move it to 25%, but we're covering everything with that.
Okay.
Where somebody's in a perfectly flat area versus somebody who's on a really sloped area. So can we bifurcate the code again and say we want a trigger for drainage code on if you're in the landslide hazard area or landslide hazard drainage area, and then a different threshold for triggering drainage review if you're in a flat area or
Okay.
outside of those drainage areas?
So I
that-
see a couple of options.
Okay.
One option could be instead of setting the 500 square foot net impervious surface limit for that threshold, instead of using 500 to set it at a smaller amount for areas that drain to landslide hazard areas, and then keep it at 500 for areas that drain to Pine and Beaver Lake. So that would be one option.
Okay.
And then the second option would be to keep the 500 square foot threshold for both areas, but add in a maximum impervious surface area that would trigger drainage review in those areas that drain to landslide hazard areas. And that could be 20%, that could be 25%, your pleasure.
Okay. And then the next question I have is, what is a typical cost for an individual homeowner to do drainage review?
Well, last week, I think we heard from a property owner during public comment, a $10,000 amount. And that to me was surprising. I actually thought it was a bit lower, but yeah, I did recall hearing that $10,000 amount.
Okay. I don't have any more lights on. Does anyone else have any questions? Councilmember Stewart?
So how are we accounting for the cumulative effects? So we set this number at something, right? Whatever, we set it at 500, we set it at 200, whatever number we set it to. How are we dealing with people who can come in under that, right? So they don't have to have a drainage review, but I think Mary has raised the point several times that if you get 20 people doing that, right? So if I get 20 people at 400 square feet, that adds up to a lot of square feet across those 20 properties that I've just added to. And if they all tend to be uphill from those poor people downhill, how are we accounting for those cumulative effects that don't get the drainage review?
So we would not account them through one individual private property owner.
Right.
The city would account for them through public projects.
Such as?
So we are taking the Zaccoos Basin Plan to the city council in upcoming study session.
Mm-hmm.
We have examples in that basin plan of public projects.
So for an area like the, Tamarack or the Inglewood, areas like that, how do all of those, so we have some, but I guess what I'm thinking is for any area that's on a steep slope, we need to have a public project that gets committed to before we can open any of this up. Otherwise, we aren't accounting for those cumulative effects until we have. So maybe that's part of it. Maybe we can say that, all of this hinges on an area having a public project to account for those cumulative effects for the things that come in under that. And if we have that in place, then it's fine to move forward. Otherwise, it feels like we have to have a lower threshold or a zero threshold, right? That says, because otherwise there's no way to protect those people. I mean, we've gotten a number of emails of people who are like, look, I own one piece of property. I'm at the bottom of the hill. I can't do anything for what's going on above me. And so there's got to be a way to account for that. So it almost feels like this is all fine and whatever numbers we come up with are fine, assuming that there is a public project already in place to account for those cumulative effects of what doesn't require a drainage review.
Okay. I'd like the council to remember that these are existing problems that are in specific areas in the city. This drainage code covers much more than just Inglewood and Tamarack.
Right.
So to resolve existing problems, we need to address them.
Right.
And if the council believes that limiting any development in those specific areas is the correct direction to go, then certainly you can direct staff to provide that.
What do you think of that? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how, like, I agree we have to address existing problems, but I don't believe we have a public project in place to address every existing problem, do we?
No, and honestly, some of those are on private property as well.
Right. And so I think there's twofold. I think there's the how do we address the current problems, and then how do we make sure we don't create any new ones or make any of the existing ones worse until there's a solution in place. At least that's what it feels like to me.
It sounds like you're proposing a moratorium in the Tamarack and Inglewood Hill areas, because that's what it would be before you get in the facilities.
Possibly. I mean, we shouldn't allow this to continue to get worse until we have something in place to account for these things. Because we're punishing existing homeowners by allowing that development to happen above them when there's absolutely nothing they can do, right?
Oh, I understand what you're saying. I'm just clarifying what you're suggesting. It sounds as if you're proposing the potential of having a moratorium in those areas until we have existing facilities.
Possibly, yeah, if that's the only way we can go. I don't know what else. I mean, I'm open to other ideas, but I don't know what else we do to make sure that we don't allow these problems to get worse.
I'm going to go on to some of the other examples, and then I would look for council direction on how to move forward. Here's a tightline exemption example, and this is a ditch and culvert system, so it would be an acceptable discharge to exempt from a tightline requirement, given the ditch and culvert system had sufficient capacity for full build-out. And then to the right is a small addition on a landslide hazard area. And kind of blowing that up is the entirety of the area that would drain to that landslide hazard area would be just the backyards of these existing developments. Every other area in that development, roof, road, driveway, would drain to a conveyance system. And it's just these backyard additions that could potentially drain to this large area to the north. This is to the north. A developer would have to provide a geotechnical report showing the slope stability analysis of this area, and they would have to show us that full build out of the area would not increase the risk of severe erosion or landslides. And then for water quality and flow control exemptions, here is an example of a lot next to Pine Lake that is entirely treed and is wishing to develop a new single-family residence. They would still be required to have drainage review. However, the flow control and water quality treatment exemptions may be considered if they were to show that significant trees would have to be removed, or the site was sloped in such a way that it would, building such a large facility, and they are quite large for such a small lot, building such a large facility would have significant downstream issues. All right, so this is where we're at.
Tony, we've got one quick
Sorry.
question. Hang on.
So back on that other one. So I like this idea because I think
Okay.
we don't want to wipe out all of those trees to put a facility like that in. But if we have this exemption, then what would be done on a lot like this for flow control and water quality?
Low impact development.
Okay.
So this is where we're at with steps, and I apologize, this has kind of been a moving target with when I'm presenting to City Council, so actually it's not June 18th today, it's July 2nd, but the next couple of months would be to go through SEPA and the Department of Commerce for approval with public hearings and a code adoption in September. So I would ask the council again, I'm going to swing way back to the very beginning on what outcome I'm hoping to have from City Council from tonight's meeting is thresholds for drainage review, exemptions to tightline and flow control facilities.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, so I think from thresholds, I kind of like the idea of having it be an either or, right? So it's 500 square feet or, 20%, whichever one you hit first, would require that. I like the idea that the mayor proposed where we can have them be different depending on if you're in a landslide hazard area or you drain to a landslide hazard area, that we have tighter restrictions than for those who don't live in or drain to such an area, I think. Or maybe it's any critical area. I don't know if it should be limited to only the landslide hazard areas, or should it be any critical area? If you're in a critical area, any kind of critical area, or drain to any critical area, should we have stricter thresholds?
Yeah, that's what the draft code has, is
Yep.
pretty much
Any-
stricter thresholds for
Any
anything that
critical
drains
area.
or is in a critical drainage area.
Okay.
But I guess I'm hearing that even stricter requirements and thresholds may be needed for areas that drain to landslide hazard areas.
Yep.
Okay.
Not just landslide hazard areas, but landslide hazard drainage areas as well, I think.
Yep. And then I think that where we have to have a way to account for cumulative effects, and until such public projects are in place, then I think that we have to say no more, right? We have to address these things.
Councilmember Hornish.
Yeah, to that point, I thought we put some restrictions in place for Inglewood and Tamarack effectively that provided if they wanted to develop there, they had to tight line to the lake. Is that not correct?
That is, once you,
Right now, currently
Yeah.
in place. Yeah.
yes, so that is requirement, no exemptions to the core requirement number 1, which is the tight line requirement, unless approved by the director, Public Works.
So we have something in place right now for those areas. If somebody does want to develop, that's what they have to do.
Correct.
And this new code would override that and
It would,
supersede?
it would clarify when the director would be able to give an exemption.
Okay. So
Right now, there's no clarification. The director can, under good engineering judgment, but it really was important for us to clarify it with the city council on when those exemptions could be made.
Well, and I think to Councilmember Stewart's point, she's kind of saying no exemptions. It's a tight line requirement until there's something available that they can tie into, is what I'm hearing, or is kind of what you're proposing. So, and I think that's kind of what we were thinking before too, which is why when we put that in place 2 years ago, put the tight line in place, that fixes it for right now anyhow. So it almost effectively says no exceptions as well. So unless there's a public project in place to be able to accept it. Thank you. The other question I had was, Mary has put together a list, and I got to tell you, I got it right before the meeting, so I haven't digested it. Has all of this kind of been, I know you've had discussions with not just Mary, but other public members. Have those been incorporated into what your currently draft, the current draft is?
Yeah, that list, I've provided a staff response in exhibit number 5 in your agenda packet for each of those. And I can go through them, kind of the bigger topics. Clarifying re-roofing is allowed without drainage review. So the existing code does allow re-roofing, so there's no change needed to the existing code. Staff is aware of this interpretation as well. She asked that we create a review checklist. A review checklist has already been created and is being used. It would be updated with any new requirements in this stormwater code update. Identifying septics above, beside, and below, plus water wells. On the septic issue, we have in there, and that's actually based on this comment, 100-foot radius.
I don't know if I want to go through each one. I just didn't know. I couldn't,
Yeah.
because I got it so briefly before the meeting, I didn't know how it corresponded to what you have. But you've addressed those comments. That's all I really wanted to find out.
Well, not all of them have been addressed in the code, to your question.
No, but she's addressed why they don't need to be addressed by the code.
Yeah, the code revisions from the draft code have not been changed from those comments.
But she's thought about it.
I don't have any more lights on, but I do have one additional question in relationship to where Councilmember Stewart was going, and then where Councilmember Hornish talked about the tight line and no exemptions to the tight line. And I'm scrolling through here and I can't find it, but the reasonable use exception is, I think the question remains, is there are still the mechanics with director discretion, even if we adopt this code, even with the no exemptions to core requirement number 1 on tight lining, which is the reasonable use exception still there for someone to build a house and get around these, or will they still have to do the tight line?
The reasonable use exception is still there. However, a tight line will be part of the requirement of any reasonable use exception. The more difficult issue is when somebody is proposing an addition to an existing home. So there's no reasonable use exception for an addition. You already have an existing home there, and the code right now says that you need to build an individual tight line for your addition. And I've given you an example of areas where that may result in 70 tight lines down a slope for these individual additions on properties, and that does not make sense.
No, I agree.
So it's the additions that we're really speaking to.
Which then, back to Councilmember Stewart's point, is that you need a capital facilities plan in place and have those projects funded in order to make.
Yeah, and I'm hearing that that may be more feasible in like the Tamarack area or the Inglewood area, but there's many other locations throughout the city that it's not going to be feasible without building, you know, like I said, 70 different tight lines for it. So if council direction is to put a stop on new additions or any net increase in impervious surface to areas that are in Tamarack and Inglewood, staff can certainly take that and move forward with that. I would just caution that if we put a blanket condition over the rest of the city, I think that's going to propose a lot of problems. And we heard from several residents last meeting about those types of problems, and I think it's reasonable that we exclude those from any stricter requirements that we may be proposing from the Tamarack or the Inglewood area.
Councilmember Stewart?
Are any of those, so when we say all the rest of the city, are we excluding other landslide hazard areas as well? Because it feels like maybe, I agree it shouldn't be a blanket statement across the entire city, but I think anywhere where we might have these landslide hazard areas, we need to understand what those are before I don't want to make a blanket yes or no statement, I guess, is where I'm coming from, is I don't want to say, yeah, it's just Inglewood and Tamarack and everything else is fine, because I don't know that everything else is fine.
So the process that we have for reviewing that under the exemptions for tightlines would be that we take a look as staff, and a geotechnical engineer takes a look as well to ensure that we're not allowing development to occur and increase risk of landslides or a severe erosion. So that coverage is provided by the technical expertise that you have here at the city and also consultants.
But only if a drainage review is performed. So in those other areas, if I'm doing an addition that falls underneath the threshold, then again, we're not doing anything to account for the cumulative effects. So again, we go back to the 20 people who add 499 square feet on, none of those had drainage reviews. So we don't get your amazing expertise looking at any of those. So now suddenly we've got thousands of square feet that have been added, and we don't know what those effects are in those critical areas. Correct?
Okay. And I guess I look at it from a realistic point of view. We've only had a handful of applicants who have come in with these new additions in these areas. It's not the situation with Tamarack where 20% of the lots have been built out in these areas. And so the risk of having that happen, I think, is very low.
Okay.
I don't have any more lights on. Any more direction or questions?
What's the takeaway for tonight? I mean, do you know, what did you get from us
Well,
that you need to change before finalizing?
Yeah, I have two. I wrote down is to bifurcate the code further for drainage review, so that there's a smaller threshold for drainage review in landslide hazard drainage areas than in areas that drain to Pine and Beaver Lake. So it'll go from a net increase of 500 square feet to your pleasure, 200 square feet. I think that would be the easiest.
Okay.
200 square feet.
Okay.
And then if there is a moratorium, then I think a vote would be appropriate.
What, we'd have to have a motion first.
A motion, sorry.
Yeah. Yes. You don't just have one in your back pocket?
I might.
Council. Oh, I was talking to the city attorney since he's the one that's going to write it. Councilor Stewart.
Do we need, I would like to make the motion that we direct our city manager and politely ask our city attorney to draft up something that would state that until a public facility is in place to account for the cumulative effects, that no one can move forward without with any exceptions, I think is what we're looking for, right? So someone can move forward if they put the appropriate facilities in place themselves, correct? But we just wouldn't allow it unless we wouldn't allow any exceptions to any of those criteria.
Yeah.
If I may, that's not a moratorium, that's just an amendment to the
Correct.
existing code
That-
provisions.
that's
that
kind of what I was
Council
looking for.
could adopt as an interim development regulation, or wait and run it through the full process and adopt it as a permanent.
That's what I was thinking. That's why when you said it's a moratorium, I was thinking, well, it's not exactly a moratorium. It's just that,
So maybe you can withdraw your motion, because that was to direct them to
Okay.
write something up.
all right,
You
I
don't
can
need the
withdraw
city-
that.
Okay,
if-
and then
if we're okay with-
restate your motion.
So what I'd like to see us do is to draft the code such that we have basically in these areas that there is a zero threshold for additions until such time as a public facility is in place.
Just additions and these areas, can you define those?
Well, I thought we were talking about the Tamarack and Inglewood
I just
are
wanted-
the areas that you said are the areas of concern, that the other areas have very little additions. The new homes would require
Tightline.
the full drainage review anyway. So it would be in the Tamarack and Inglewood areas that until such time as a public facility is in place, that there could be a zero threshold for all of these requirements. Or for at least for the drainage review to be.
Right.
Right. Because we have to have a way to account for these cumulative effects. And you said the only way to do that is to have a public project in place. So until that's in place, we can't allow cumulative effects.
Okay, I think I understand.
We need a second first.
We're not having debate until we have a
Second.
second.
Right.
Okay, it's
Do we
been
have a
seconded.
second? Okay. Now go
Okay,
ahead.
now we can have
Yes.
deliberation.
Thank you, Mayor.
So the motion, as I transcribe it in some fashion, is to draft a code for the Tamarack and Inglewood Hill areas that public facilities must be in place or no
can do it.
additions may be added, correct? Did I capture that accurately, Councilmember Stewart?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? No, an addition can or cannot be added?
Additions cannot be added. Did I capture?
Unless the proper,
Yeah, I would say net new impervious surface.
without proper drainage controls, right? So if somebody wants to put the addition and they meet all of the criteria, then that would be fine, correct? It's only, what we're trying to avoid is that people are adding things without putting any additional drainage facilities at all in place, correct?
Correct.
And so I don't think we have to not allow them to ever happen. We just can't allow them to happen unless they meet the criteria, that there's no exceptions to all of the drainage review criteria. Is that appropriate?
In the
or-
Tamarack and Inglewood areas that drain to landslide hazards,
Yep.
drainage review would be required for any net new impervious surfaces proposed.
Yes.
Furthermore, no exemptions to tight lines will be allowed until public infrastructure is put in place to protect landslide hazard areas.
Correct. I like that. What she said. I would like to amend my motion to be what she said.
You got funny faces up here, so I'm not even sure the people up here know what exactly she said, but I think we've got it, or at least I think we've does everyone understand what the motion on the floor is?
There's two parts to it.
There are two parts to it. There's a drainage review requirement for any net new impervious surface, and there are no exemptions to the tight line until public infrastructure is in place.
Correct.
Mayor, we need an amended second, if there is one.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded, so now we
Thank
can
you.
have discussion. Councilmember Stewart, did you want to speak to your motion?
No, I am good. Thanks.
Okay, Councilmember Hornish.
I agree with the second part with no exemptions to the tight line. But the first part, I think we were going to reduce it with a bifurcation from the 500 down to 200, which is what we just said. I think 200 is a little more realistic than going to zero, frankly. So I'm not sure how to vote if it's a two-piece motion. I'm for half of it. Can I vote half? Yay?
No, you vote no, and then you can bring a new motion
All right.
on the
Up
second
to
half.
200 square feet for landslide hazard drainage areas that were not in Inglewood or Tamarack
Right.
areas.
Well, I guess that's true.
Okay, so just to clarify.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. But if we made it 200 across the board, that would apply to Inglewood and Tamarack as well.
Not with this motion, though.
Yes.
Now
she
with
just
this
said
motion,
yes.
then this would take it to zero. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
I want to do that.
Deputy Mayor Moran.
So for clarification so is this also saying that we're going to be putting in public facilities then in each one of those areas?
Well, it's just saying that we have to make sure that that if somebody wants to add any impervious surface in those areas, they have to do the proper drainage facilities themselves until such time as a public facility is in place. So it doesn't require us to do it. It just means that if there isn't one in place, then we can't have these thresholds, because the cumulative effects of everything that falls below that threshold will just continue to add up, and it will never get managed. And that's what's happening now, is that the things that fall under these thresholds keep getting added, and then that stormwater doesn't get managed, and it continues to flow downhill onto the existing homeowners. So it doesn't say we have to, it just says that until they are there, that if anybody wants to add anything, they have to make sure that they're managing their stormwater.
Deputy Mayor Moran, you still have the floor.
No, I'm good.
You're good. Okay. Councilmember Valderrama.
So I've got points that have been raised previously. I'll follow on Councilmember Moran's. First of all, I think by putting the words public infrastructure there in the statement, instead of saying you have to do it yourself, you are creating at least an illusion of a possibility that there will be one when there may not in fact be one, and I've heard you say that now that you're saying. So if we take that public infrastructure wording out of it and just say you have to tightline and put your own facilities in, but not leave out the words until public infrastructure is put in place and just mandate that in, it would be easier for me to accept, because I'm concerned that there may be some people who would understand that to mean that the city is going to be putting some public infrastructure at some day, which may or may not happen, but you then create a potential impression of that. So I'm uncomfortable with those words. And again, for the restrictions, I'm the one who originally pushed the council 4 years ago to put it in for for Englewood Hill Road for that emergency ordinance, and then they copied that the next year for the Tamarack one out there. So I'm very concerned about it. I'm just concerned of a creation of an impression, again, that there will be a public infrastructure put in. Additionally, if I understood correctly, that there isn't any rush right now into it, and I'd like to know the date. When is the interim ordinance being expected? I thought you had a chart up here earlier on. What is that date that this would be a stopgap that we're talking about doing for?
Well, I proposed a September meeting for public hearing and adoption.
We're gone August, and we're now in July, so this would then just hold till September. And do we have anybody in process now that, I know it sounds good, but does this have any real effect, or are we just creating work?
No, there's already a stopgap in place. This would be in the code so that when the new code replaces what's there, we don't open up the floodgates.
Can we follow a procedure with questions being asked versus a debate?
Councilmember Valderrama has the floor.
So as I understand, so it's till September when you're coming back to us, and then we're going to be looking at. So this would be in effect for the rest of July, August, we're gone in September. So we're talking about that period in there. And I guess the concern is that there may be a mad rush in the interim to go in. But from what I heard previously, I thought you had said that there's not much activity going on anyways. Was I correct or not?
There's probably less than 6 that we're looking at right now.
That are already in?
Yes.
So depending on their stage, we wouldn't even be able to affect those. So I'm looking at what's the real value that we're going to get out of this for that short period of time, and then that language in there. And again, I am concerned. I'm the one who put it in 4 years ago and the 3 years ago for those two. I'm just trying to figure out, are we going to do a big administrative exercise with no real utility coming out? Do you think there would be a utility? Maybe that's a better question.
Well, we are planning to take a 6-year stormwater CIP list to City Council in 2020. So we will present to you projects, stormwater projects, at that time. We have a number identified in the Zacus Basin Plan that has still in draft and has yet to be adopted by the City Council. But once that basin plan is adopted, we will have an established set of CIP projects to work from off of the other CIP projects that City Council has already approved us moving forward with, such as the Fish Passage projects. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, just to clarify, so if I understand it correctly, right now, there's already something in place that is preventing, right? There's a zero threshold essentially in place for Tamarack and Inglewood, correct?
That's correct.
So what I'm proposing isn't an interim. It isn't from now until September. There's already a zero threshold in place. What I'm proposing is that in September, when we adopt this new code, that we add this to that new code so that there is still a zero threshold in place in Tamarack and Inglewood. That's what my motion is to add this to the new code, because otherwise in September, assuming we approve this new stormwater code, that the zero threshold would be lifted from Tamarack and Inglewood. So it isn't an interim. Just to address your question, this is to make it going forward until such time as there's some way to account for the cumulative effects. And if there's nothing accounting for cumulative effects, then there's a zero threshold. Does that make sense? Valderrama?
Mr. City Manager's got his light on here.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. What she said. Okay. So this is a motion just to direct staff to work with our attorney to write some language for code that we can bring back for adoption at a particular time. We can bring it back, and if we have to make minor changes at a time, we can do that, right? I mean, this is something we need to do. So we do have something in place right now, but we want to make sure, is what I'm hearing from council, or the majority of the council, is that we want to make sure we have something in place for the future. So I understand, Councilor Valderrama, I understand your issue that you have with saying the public, but at this time, there's something already in place, and then we can modify it. Maybe Mike can chime in, but we can do that once we bring it back for adoption to the council. We'll have proposed language, but then the motion there to adopt it, if you choose to adopt it, we can make some minor adjustments at that time.
All right. Yeah, if you're cognizant to make sure that that language has been modified, not to say that about the public infrastructure, or you've caveated it, then I would be supportive of that in September to review it.
Deputy Mayor Moran.
I would agree with.
There you go.
I would agree with Councilmember Valderrama. My only concern is I know how I feel about the public infrastructure in those areas, but I don't know where the council is as a whole. Before I would want to see that, be adopted into any code, I would want to have the discussion as a council and see where everybody is.
Absolutely, Councilor, and that's what we plan on doing. This is just a directive to direct staff to get the ball rolling so we can bring it back.
Can I ask a clarifying question, just to make sure my understanding is correct based on this motion here? Is that this essentially makes absolutely no change to what's currently in place. Is that correct? I mean, it essentially carries forward existing policy that we have right now, which is a zero threshold for drainage review, correct?
You're speaking specifically to the Tamarack and Inglewood areas?
Yes, which this motion is addressing.
Yes.
Correct? And then because we're saying there's no exception to tight lines, we already have that because that's core requirement number 1, so they're required to do that anyway. So essentially this is just continuity with what we currently have.
It is. However, I will remind council, the last time you met, you gave authority to the director to use good engineering judgment to review and potentially approve exceptions to the core requirements. And from that council direction, the city developed a policy paper on when we would approve or disapprove exemptions to the core requirements. We will change that with this meeting based on the direction that I'm hearing tonight on those policies. When the director would provide exemption. So that the previous policy allowed ditch and culvert system to be used as an avenue for an appropriate discharge for areas that are in landslide hazards. Now, we will change that so that if you are in the Inglewood or Tamarack areas, the director will not allow any kind of exemptions to tight lines.
Well,
And that does not
let me
need us
just
to
jump in on
change
that, because
the code.
Council adopted a motion. Tawny's referring to a motion that the council adopted to give the director that discretion, and that was in response to several citizens who came and said we need that discretion. So if the council wants to change its motion, it needs to do so by motion or resolution. So we won't be changing that policy until we get a majority vote.
Until we vote here.
Right.
At least, yes, yes. Okay, so hold on. Couple questions, unless you were kind of cut off mid-sentence, so you can finish where you were at.
That's fine.
Okay. You mentioned there were 6 projects. Are they 6 projects in the Inglewood and Tamarack areas specifically?
Not that I am aware of, no.
Okay, so how many projects are specific to Tamarack and Inglewood?
I cannot give that answer to you right now. I don't know.
So fair to say not very many?
Well,
Less than 6.
Yeah, 6 is not very many, so yes.
No, you said 6 to an earlier question, but I wasn't sure if the 6 was, hold on a second, was relative to those 2 areas or in general for additions in?
General for additions throughout the city.
Throughout the city,
Yeah.
and that is an important distinction.
Absolutely.
As far as I'm concerned. Okay. So you mentioned the 2020 CIP that will be brought to council for stormwater, and embedded in this, and I think it's been mentioned several times before, is this public infrastructure is in place. And I think that we haven't had the discussion, which is the next agenda after the 4 items that we pulled off consent, relative to public funds on private. And I think that is an important element of this entire conversation. Before we say that we're going to do that, I think we need to gauge the temperature of the council on where we're at relative to using public funds on private infrastructure before we embed that into a motion. I would, circle back on that, because like Councilmember Stewart, I too am concerned about the cumulative impacts. I have been in the Inglewood Hill area. I have been up in Tamarack. I have seen all that stormwater coming down. It is truly, a concern. And so I want to be sure that we're mindful and we have the mechanics in place to require that drainage review. So it sounds like we have that, but we also have the ability for the director then to use his discretion, with the exception of the tight line, correct? Okay. And my thought is the tight line's probably like a virtual moratorium, is it not? I mean, it's so costly to put in a tight line. You're required to get easements across other people's property. There's a high hurdle.
I would agree, yes.
Okay, so it's like a virtual moratorium. Okay. I think I might be able to, similar to what Councilmember Valderrama said, I might be able to be supportive of this if we didn't tie in that one piece before we have the conversation, which is a couple of agenda items later. I do support the idea of having some public facilities, but I think we need to understand where the council lands on those public facilities relative to private infrastructure before we can marry ourselves to that. But I do think it would be wise to have some option for council when they bring back that code language relative to this. But it sounds like nothing's going to get built in there anyway with current language. It's the change in September that will lift that bar to some other number.
That's what this motion is to include in the September updates.
Is to keep things on the same playing field, with the removal of the director discretion was just the caveat. Okay. Councilmember Hornish.
Since the motion is to draft, I am of the opinion or thought process that we don't need to draft. I think it's a waste of time. And if you don't even go down that road, even in September, it's going to go to 200 feet for those 2 areas, right? So we're talking the difference between 200 and 0. I just think it's a little bit more, and I'm very concerned about council changing direction for staff as to what they're going to be interpreting now versus what they interpreted 2 weeks ago or a week ago. 2 weeks ago. Very concerned about that. I think at some point, I'm going to use my same analogy, we need to drive a stake in the ground and go with it. And I think with this change to 200, it's sufficient to minimize the cumulative impacts versus going to 0. And change, well, let me ask you this. By going to the 200, would that change the staff interpretation?
Yeah, because it was at 500.
Yeah.
So yeah, we would have to change that.
That would change your current interpretation as well. Rats.
So much for your steak.
Yeah, exactly. I'm still of the mindset that 200 is probably sufficient, gives a little more leeway. So I'm not sure we need to spend the time on the drafting, but I'm concerned about the staff interpretation and the caveats that you're looking at. So, okay.
Councilmember Ritchie.
Would Councilmember Stewart be willing to table her motion until we are able to review the issues on agenda item number 10?
I'd be willing to modify the wording that I use in my motion to not include public facilities, but to just say facilities need to be in place, and until such time as some facility, because that means that someone could privately build, right? So a development could build their own. It doesn't have to say public. So I'd be willing to modify it to take the public out, if that makes everybody feel more comfortable.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, I just want to add, so I would like to amend my own motion to remove the word public and just say facility. A facility needs to be in place, and until such time the threshold is 0. I would just like to say that it isn't that it's 200 square feet. It's that by having that 200 square feet, every year I could come and add on 200 square feet, as could everybody else on the uphill, right? So it's every time I come and apply, and it's everybody who's on the uphill side can do that. So I think for these two specific areas, the threshold needs to be 0 for the drainage review to make sure that we aren't having uncontrolled cumulative effects.
Councilmember Ritchie, you originally seconded that. She's amended her motion.
I'll second it again.
Great. Okay. I don't have any more lights on. Any more questions? All right. Seeing none. All those in favor, and I'll repeat the motion as best I can here, is to draft additional code language for the Tamarack and Inglewood Hill areas. That drainage review will be required for any net new impervious surface, no exemptions to tight lines until proper facilities are in place. Good?
Love it.
Okay. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Okay. By a vote of 6-1, the motion passes.
Excellent.
Any additional comments or anything we want to pass to staff before we move on?
I guess one thought on public infrastructure. Sometimes developers build infrastructure and then dedicate it to the public. So that would also be public infrastructure. And then, so on next steps, we'll draft these codes and likely just bring it as a public hearing, since we've met so many times before. Hear from the public, hear from the city council, and then after that, hopefully adoption. Great, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, Tony. Tony, is that the last time we hear from you, or are you sticking around for some of these other ones we have on here? Is that it?
No, she has the next one.
Okay, good. Well, then we won't say goodbye and thank you yet. We'll wait.
I'm participating in the next one.
Okay, we won't let you get away too easy then. Okay, so now we need to circle back to some unfinished business relative to the consent calendar. We have item number 4. Deputy Mayor Moran, you pulled that. This is the contract for Southeast 8th Street, the 218th Avenue Southeast Corridor preliminary analysis.
After going back and listening to the end of the meeting that I missed, I believe it was last week, could have been the week
2 weeks
before.
ago.
Two weeks ago. And then listening to it again yesterday, the motion was made that the projects that were on the tip that were going to require funding and that were going to be studied and were going to be looked at and analyzed, and all were going to be talked about on the 16th or on the 18th, whatever the next meeting was. 16th. And so I believe that's where this belongs. So I'm going to make the motion that this be moved to that meeting because it's with the other projects that are on the tip, and I believe that's where this one belongs.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved to seconded. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of moving this item to the July 16th meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Okay, by a vote of 5-1. Yes, we have one council member missing. We will move that to the July 16th meeting. Okay, item number 5.
Mayor,
Yes.
if I may, if there's any particular questions that you have for us so that we'll be ready to answer them on the 16th, I'd appreciate it if you could send them along. Sure. Thank you.
I can give you one right now because I looked at it. So this changes the road classification on Southeast 8th Street as well as that kind of 218th. And I can't remember what the
Collector arterial.
collector arterial. Thank you. I'm very personally concerned about the reference in the agenda bill that states that we will be this road, the study will be done in reference to our public works standards, which state a 70-foot right of way and 3 lanes. My eyes kind of pop open when I think about 3 lanes on Southeast 8th Street and 218th. So those are my concerns and reclassification of the roadway.
So again, this will be a study. If that's not appropriate, that's certainly not what we will be recommending.
Okay.
I mean, I'll bring up Sahali. Same with Sahali. Sahali, the standard is a 5-lane. We are not recommending at all a 5-lane.
Okay.
So.
The only reason I
that's
bring that
part of
up is the agenda bill stated specifically that we would be looking at it through the lens of our adopted public works standards, and that's what our public works
And
standards.
that's one of the reasons that I wanted to go on next week. The other thing is it doesn't call out who's going to be doing any of the modeling or anything, so I wanted to make sure that that ended up in there. Oh, sorry.
Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council, we already voted on this item. We cannot discuss it anymore. So if you wanted to discuss it prior, because the item's already been motioned and approved, so to table, so we shouldn't be discussing it. We should move on to the next item. I do apologize for that, but that is protocol. If you have questions, yeah, get it to Cheryl afterwards. So thank you guys very much.
Okay, item number 5, which is the contract for the 2019-2020 Concurrency Management and Transportation Traffic Engineering Services contract with DEA. David Evans and Associates. Deputy Mayor Moran, you pulled that item.
I did. This is a really expensive item, and so I was wondering, this had gone out to bid, and had this gone out to bid for $650,000? I mean, we know that we've had people in our own city tell us that we were paying an awful lot for our modeling, and that we could get it done cheaper and faster. So I'm wondering, had this gone out for bid?
This one we did not. DEA has been our city's traffic modeler for, well, as long as I've been here, which is almost 5 years. There is a lot to be said for continuing on with DEA because they do understand all the, pretty much all the nuances of our city and where the hot spots are, just because they've been modeling not only for some of our sort of scenario kind of quick questions, but also certainly for all of our concurrency applications. Now, $650,000 does look like a lot, but most of it will be recouped through permit fees. So this isn't, $650,000 for project work on city's capital projects and programs. Most of it, again, is for concurrency testing. We do have a task in there to do some scenario testing for the town center. They've asked us to not officially do a full traffic model for their concurrency application, but to allow them to kind of say, well, if we formally submit this scenario, what happens with our traffic system? So it does look like a lot, but again, I want to reassure the council that most of it is recovered through permit fees.
Okay, well, I know that there is other people out there that can do this and know this model well. So I'm going to suggest that I make the motion that this go out to bid.
That this what?
That this
Go out to bid.
go out to bid.
Councilmember Hornish, you have your light on.
I'll second the motion for discussion.
And Mayor,
Okay,
just if I could clarify, typically when we say go out to bid, it means actually obtain bids and pick the low responsible bidder. It's probably a tribute to the lobbyists that work for architects and engineers in this state, but there's a specific statute that deals with soliciting architectural and engineering services like this. And what that statute says is we ask for qualifications, statements of qualifications, we review those, and we pick the one that we like best, and only then do we begin to negotiate fee. So just a heads up that we may not get the lowest fee for architectural and engineering services.
So question to the attorney. So in effect,
Hold on.
we are getting the most, supposedly from our perspective, the most qualified one, at least from that process, and then you go to see the cost.
That's exactly what this statute contemplates, right?
Councilmember Hornish?
So that's actually right in line with my question. Are you aware of anybody else that could do this modeling and testing under the concurrency model?
Yes, there are many consultants.
Are there other people as familiar with Sammamish as DEA?
You know, I would say not that many. I mean, DEA has been, again, modeling all of our concurrency tests. They have refined the traffic model throughout the last 2 years working with council on the concurrency policies. And so they know the model by far the best than any other consultant, just because they've been refining it and they've been using it.
Would they be willing to give it to somebody else to use the model, or do they own that proprietary model? It's our model, right? I mean,
that's correct.
So somebody else could go get that model from them, especially if they were familiar with it.
They would have to relearn, because there's a lot of assumptions.
Unless they happen to have designed it.
There are a lot of assumptions. You know, modeling certainly is a science, but there is an art to it as well.
I
and
totally
so
agree.
whenever, yes, we would certainly give this model to the next consultant, and they would certainly have to spend a fair amount of time getting familiar with what the assumptions were in the model and how it runs. And then certainly to learn just the city's traffic and transportation system itself and replicate that as best you can in the model.
So what I'm thinking is in this motion, what we'd really want to see is if you could find somebody that would have that background and knowledge and experience, that would be an option to maybe consider. Is that what we're really talking about in the motion, especially under the statute, it sounds like? Okay, just a clarification. Okay.
You know, you can certainly find other consultants.
Okay.
DEA has been giving us great customer service.
And I agree. And I want to make sure, though, that if we have an alternative, that somebody really understands this model for this city, is my point. And I think that's probably why we have that statute under RCW, that you don't just have to take the low bid and get, not so good work. So, okay, thanks.
Councilmember Stewart?
Mr. City Manager, how much time are we going to ask, will this take from our staff? And is this really a worthwhile use of our time if we don't have any specific concerns with the current consulting company who's been doing this? And if there are specific concerns, then let's get them out here so that we're all aware of those, because this feels like we're going to add a lot more work, and I'm not sure what we're going to benefit from this.
Councilor, I really can't answer how much time. Maybe Cheryl can answer how much time, but it will take some time, but it is a process we can follow if the council so chooses. I kind of like it the way it is. However, if the council wants to change that, they're more than willing. Cheryl, I mean, how much time?
It would take 2 to 3 months.
There you go.
And if you chose to not approve this contract, we will need to bring a request to at least add some more money to DEA's current contract, because we're running out, and we need the capacity to continue to do the work while we acquire another consultant.
Yeah.
I have a question relative to one of the questions that the deputy mayor asked, which was the last time we went out to bid, and you said DEA has been our modeler ever since you've been here for 5 years. Mm-hmm. For other contracts that we award of this sort, how often do we go back out for bid? Is 5 years unusual? Is it typical? I mean, and it sounds like it's probably been greater than 5 years, but.
You know, I can't speak for all contracts. I used to work for Seattle Public Utilities, and we would often renew contracts just because the consultant team has done a really good job. They've met all of our requirements. Going out back on the street to acquire another consultant when your existing consultant has been doing everything you've asked them to do, it is a lot of work, and then you're also paying this new consultant to get up to speed, which takes time and money. It's certainly doable. It certainly is doable, but we have been very, very happy and satisfied with DEA's work.
Deputy Mayor Moran?
I'm used to working in a situation where after a certain number of time, just to make sure that the numbers are right, and that you go out and you get new bids. I'm not saying anything bad about anybody, I'm just saying you get new bids. This contract looks like there's a lot of fluff in it. The numbers look big to me. So I want to make sure that we're getting the best value we can. And I see, from what I can tell, you could have a couple of full-time people in here for a long time. So I'm just, for me, I think that, if you've got somebody that you're using for that long, that you probably ought to check the numbers. That's my opinion.
So the way that the contract is written is that it is based on their hourly rate, which is very, very competitive with other consultant firms of their size and services that they provide. So, I mean, that is that's what these kinds of contracts do is you identify what the universe of activities and deliverables you think that they might provide, and then you really pay based on the hours. And then some on materials, but really it's brain power that you're buying.
Jen? Okay. Councilmember Ross?
I also think it's important to consider accessibility and responsiveness. So I would think that's one of the most critical elements as we move forward, because if it's on an hourly basis and we don't have access or we take a long time, it also burns a lot of council time and we don't make decisions as quick as we can. So that's another criteria that I'd like to see if we do put it out to bid. And I do agree that 5 years is a long time without at least refreshing the bidding process. Typically you stay with the incumbent if they're doing a good job, but it does keep them honest from a business standpoint on the price that the city is paying. So I think we do, as a council, have a fiduciary duty to ensure that the taxpayers are paying for what they are receiving.
Okay, I don't have any more lights on, so if there's no more discussion, the motion was to put the contract for concurrency management, transportation, traffic engineering services out for bid. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
The nays, can they raise their hand, please? I can see. Okay, by a vote of 5-2, we will be putting this out to bid. Okay, the next item was item 7. This is contract 2019-2021 stormwater system maintenance, parks and facilities with ProVac. Deputy Mayor Moran, you pulled this one as well.
Sorry. This has to do, my issue with this, and this leads back to, and I think I have a question for our attorney, has to do with a company that we know was involved with the dumping of some contents of something or another. It's an ongoing investigation. But there's still a lot of questions. We have not had a report. There's a lot of questions that aren't answered in that. And so that's, until we've kind of cleared that, I guess my feeling is I personally have an issue doing any contracts with anybody until we've done a full clearance of that. So I think we should pull this for right now.
There's no motion.
Councilmember Ritchie.
So my motion is that this be pulled, and it be given to somebody else until such time that we've, that this particular company has gone through and we have finalized any sort of investigation.
Are you proposing to table it for 1 month, date certain, or?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Councilmember Ritchie.
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, Councilmember Valderrama.
I'm concerned with the casting of, and by even the tabling of it, if there's some liability to us, there's a presumption or an insinuation that there could be something wrong with this. And so And then at least everything that I've seen to date doesn't seem to be going in that direction. So I don't know until somebody has been found to be guilty or that if we can be taking that action without, frankly, putting a liability on the city itself on that.
Well, I don't know either. That's what I'm saying.
Hold on. It's okay. Councilmember Valderrama, you?
Yeah.
Go.
No, until I'm uncomfortable with that rationale reasoning.
Okay. Councilmember Ritchie.
I'd like to ask for a brief executive session to discuss these issues before we vote on this with the city attorney.
I would second that.
And the basis would be potential litigation, I
Yes.
take?
That's correct.
Okay.
10 minutes?
If that.
Fine. 10 minutes. Okay, so we have a motion on the floor that has been seconded, which was to...
I'll remove my motion.
Okay. Motion withdrawn. I'd entertain another motion.
I move we approve the contract.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Yay.
Okay, by a vote of 6-1, the ProVac contract has been approved. Okay, finally, one last consent calendar item that was pulled. Item number 8, approval of the minutes for the June 18th, 2019 regular meeting. Councilmember Hornish, you pulled this item?
Yes, I noticed a couple of discrepancies on some matters that I had talked about, and I would like to move that we have the city clerk go back, listen to the tape, and modify and revise the minutes from June 18th and bring them back at the next meeting for approval.
Second. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
Can you be more specific about what the city clerk needs to do?
There was one thing in there which was inconsistent, where I had moved that it would go from council to city manager, and then Councilmember Ritchie moved the same thing in the next paragraph, and I never moved that, so that was an error. So that's at least one error, and then I think reading through, I'm not sure that it followed the course of the discussions that we had concerning the TIP either. So it's just a housekeeping administrative, and I noticed it too late, and I apologize to have it done before this meeting.
Okay. I don't see any more discussion. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, we will have the city clerk's office review those minutes. Okay, some of you have taken a break, others of us have not. So shall we take a quick break here and then dive in? Okay. Okay, our next item of business is the discussion. This is public responsibilities to resolve private drainage issues. Mr. City Manager.
Hello. Okay. Sorry, I'm still kind of a novice at this. So good evening, Council. Danica Globakar, Senior Stormwater Engineer, and myself and Tawny Dalzell, our Program Manager for Stormwater, will be facilitating a discussion tonight on the public's responsibility to resolve these private drainage issues. Obviously, a very pertinent topic given the conversation you just had earlier this meeting. So the impetus for this discussion this evening at this time is twofold. One, because you have heard, years of drainage complaints from private citizens about drainage issues that they cannot resolve themselves. A lot in the Tamarack area, that's predominantly where we hear these complaints, somewhat Inglewood. And then also the other impetus for this is that in 2015, 2016, there was a project that the city was proposing in the Tamarack neighborhood, and it was paused during the budget discussions and slightly before that for several reasons. But one of them was so that council could better understand this public responsibility issue and investing public funds to resolve these private issues. And they tabled it. The council then tabled that project, or pause that project, and said after the Zaccoos Basin Plan is complete, we'll be in a place, better able to make a decision about this issue. So the plan is in a final draft form, waiting for adoption, as you know. So this is a great time to talk about this. So the discussion, like I said, it's less of a presentation, more of a discussion with you and with our city attorney. We want to discuss the legal and policy background for why we would or would not perform work, use public funds on private property. I'm going to talk a little bit about Tamarack's history, and then discuss the city's options for alleviating some of these problems. All right, so I'm going to start big picture. What drives our policy? And that's Washington State constitutional law. So Article 8, Section 7, it's the gift of public funds doctrine. And this is the italicized print there is copied verbatim. I've added the little underlines if you want to read that. But I translated it into layman's terms. So the underlined pieces say, no city, Sammamish, shall hereafter give any money to or in aid of any individual, association, company, or corporation. The purpose of this, translated, is to prevent public funds from being used to benefit private interests where the public interest is not primarily served. So again, we say you can't use public funds on private property. This is the constitutional law where it stems from. There's been further clarification over the years by the Washington Supreme Court that public funds can be expended on private property to carry out a fundamental purpose of government. And there's many broad categories of this. How it pertains to, in our situation, you could consider safety, obviously a public function, or a fundamental purpose of government. Also water quality, when we're talking stormwater projects, those are fundamental purposes of government. So if we were to do a project, say improving, then a portion of that would propose to improve water quality, that would provide a benefit to the general public, and therefore we could argue that a fundamental public purpose is served, and therefore we could expend public funds for that portion of a project. I'm going to dive down a little bit more now into our city code and our city policies. Here's an SMC, and the title of this section is Drainage Facilities Accepted by Sammamish for Maintenance. Again, I've copied out that italicized part verbatim, and that's just a portion of it. There's additional notes in there. But it says that the city may assume, so we may take on maintenance of a private drainage system or facility if a clear public benefit will result, greater in scope than the public cost. Again, translated, that means to use city funds and to take on a private drainage system, there must be a benefit to the public that's greater than the cost the city would incur from doing that project. Another code, drainage facilities not accepted by Sammamish for maintenance. You can see it's the same italicized underlined format, but translated, this just means that private property owners and road owners must maintain their own facilities. The city does not maintain those conveyance systems. Okay, so that's, like I said, that's the code, the big picture law that governs our policies towards using public funds. I'm going to transition now to Tamarack, and just a reminder that that policy, those laws, those apply to all private property in the city, not just Tamarack and Inglewood. But because Tamarack is such a focused item, we're just going to use this as a case study. So a little bit of the city's history in Tamarack. And some points that aren't on here, a lot of things you know already. It's a historic plat. It was platted in 1964. I think 60% of the single lots were constructed between 1980 and the year 2000, around when we incorporated. I have some other facts about it. Since the 2000s, everything has been infill development. It's private storm drains, private ditch and culvert systems, and there's no HOA. There's no governing body to, govern this drainage system. So the city has received complaints and concerns from citizens since about 2007 that I know. Obviously, I wasn't here for the city in 2007, but I've seen through public record that there are cases where the city has heard complaints from people or concerns. So some other key pertinent dates. between 2011 and 2016, so 2016 we start getting on this chart here, there have been pulses of city funding to investigate solutions, not to pay for solutions, but to investigate engineering design, to try to quantify the issues. So there has been city funding going into finding a solution. 2013, when we started in this, my little arrow chart, there was a landslide on private property just south of Mary's house, and this is a picture of it right here. And you can see the land slough at the bottom of these stairs. There's a sewer easement in this area where Sam Platt has a sewer line going in here. And there was another private drainage tight line installed in this same width. So there was a landslide in 2013. Our then city manager directed city maintenance crews to install an overland pipe and just cover it, like stop the bleeding in this spot, and they did. That precipitated a close look at looking at a project in this area, looking at the Tamarack Tightline project, I call it, which would look to collect water above this and take it down below this landslide hazard area. And that was in the 2015-2016 time range. You'll see there in spring of 2016, there were a lot of project financing questions about whether a local improvement district or utility local improvement district would be needed, how the city would get easements, how the city would pay for this, or how citizens would pay for this. And the project kind of lost a lot of momentum, slowed down because of those questions. Then in late 2016, during budget discussions, council asked 3 pertinent questions, and all this is public record that I scoured hours of council meetings to find this. That it was, there were 3 things that council asked for. They wanted to clarify this public fund use on private property. It's, again, something I think that is in question today. Council asked, how does this particular project, being a project that tightlines Tamarack's water, how does that compare with the city's other stormwater needs? Are we diverting funds from the rest of the city to patch this spot? And they also asked, how does this project tie in with the rest of Zaccoos Basin? And the decision was made, okay, pause this until we look at the Zaccoos Basin plan. And like I said, that's sort of where we stand today, that the Zaccoos Basin plan has been relatively completed, and we're still hearing from citizens about their concerns with this spot. So the city does have options. I'll start with number 2, status quo, because it's easy to explain, which is maintaining status quo. The city council can direct staff to maintain the status quo, which has been the city's course of action since incorporation. It is continuing to issue permits while following our drainage code to make sure we're following our standards, but it would not propose a city project in this private neighborhood or any private property. The other option is that the city council could direct staff to investigate construction of drainage improvements in Tamarack. And Mike, if I say anything wrong, please correct me. I'm obviously not a lawyer, I'm just an engineer. Oh no. Well, okay, so if the city council elected to direct staff to look at doing a construction project in Tamarack on private property, here are some of the pertinent concerns that you need to be aware of, because there are risks and concerns. So the city could legally fund, again legally because this is Washington state law, we could legally fund the portion of a project that would improve water quality because it served a fundamental purpose of government and it would benefit the public. However, private property owners would have to fund the remainder of the project through a local improvement, most likely through a local improvement district. That's my understanding of the funding mechanism for that. But we could not have a gift of public funds concern. That would be, I believe, illegal, is expending public funds for private benefit. If there was a local improvement district generated, it would require a majority vote by the residents, by the Tamarack homeowners, to participate in a local improvement district. That's obviously very difficult because it would be an additional assessment on those properties, and that's not palatable from what I understand. It's very difficult, as you can imagine, to allocate the public versus private benefit. It's, they're kind of tied together. If you do a water quality improvement, there has to be some kind of conveyance to get the water to a water quality facility. So it's difficult to allocate, what's public, what's private, and to get the 2 parties to agree to that. So that's challenging. Also, if we did any work there, the roads are private. We don't own them. It's harder to protect our infrastructure. But if we had easements on that location, that would protect our infrastructure, It would allow us to access and maintain that infrastructure. But again, obtaining easements would require approval of everybody with a legal interest in that road, on the private roads, and that could be the entire plat. That is still a question I believe we're trying to clear up on our end. So it could require I think there's 160 properties-ish in the Tamarack neighborhood. It could require approval of those easements by those 160 people. So it's owners, lenders, people with liens on properties. Again, very difficult. This would also, if the city began work on this kind of project, it would set a precedent of the city doing similar work on other private property. So again, nothing that's insurmountable, but it is, risks to consider for city council. So with that, we have decision 1 or decision 2. There's other options available to residents. There are other King County programs. So I have 2 here. There's King County has a neighborhood drainage assistance program. It addresses, only a $70,000 budget, but it addresses small projects in unincorporated King County. There would be, we do have funds in the Stormwater Fund that we could manage a similar type of program. It would require a lot more staff effort, and again, there might be some questions of gift of public funds. That is something, obviously, it's a very small budget, and it would not be able to create a $1 million plus tightline. But it could solve smaller property-specific issues that people have. Also, there is a King Conservation District. As you see, it's a non-regulatory state agency that helps partner with private property owners to create opportunities, and they give free technical advice and do have grants and provide some financial assistance. Again, it is smaller in scope than a $1 million tightline. It could provide site-specific relief to drainage issues, however.
Councilmember Ritchie, did you have a question?
She's finished. Thank you.
Okay.
And that's really it. It's just kind of telling you, you've heard from citizens for the last, several years, for as long as I think everyone here has been on council. And this was a good opportunity to facilitate this discussion, to allow our attorney to help clarify any issues. And if you council want to direct staff to start looking at a project for the Tamarack neighborhood, this would be a good place to start discussing that. So.
Okay, so I'm of the opinion that the status quo is no longer tenable. I don't know that it ever was in the first place, but I understand why we did it for as long as we did it. I would like to move that we direct staff to prepare a series of improvements for the Tamarack, for drainage improvements in Tamarack.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion. Councilmember Ritchie, did you want to speak to your motion?
I'll just say briefly that I think we need to kind of, this is what I believe the role of the city council should be. We should start the process. We should initiate the conversation, knowing that I recognize it's going to take a partnership between the neighborhood, the citizens that live there, and the private neighborhood. If they won't play ball, then this isn't going to get very far. But I think we need to actually start the process and show that we are interested, potentially, in moving forward on acting in the greater good here. Everything that I've read, and when I doorbell the neighborhood, it's a serious concern, and it's not getting any better. And I think that it is the right thing to do for our city, for the lake, for the little redfish, to start dealing with these issues one neighborhood by neighborhood. But I think Tamarack is a long-standing history, long-time problem. I think it's time we act on it. And I think this is a first step, showing a good faith step forward by the city, potentially, that could, then you could go to the neighborhood and say, hey, the city council's looking to move forward on this. What do you guys think? What would, what options do they have in front of them, and maybe create a partnership where there hasn't been one for a long time. That's my hope. So that's why I'm making the motion. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Moran.
I feel like what we incorporated 20 years ago, that the idea is that you took the good with the bad. And the city has taken a lot of good, and this is some of the bad. And I think the city needs to buck up and take care of it. It's one of those things that it's not just in Tamarack, it's not just in Inglewood, there's going to be other places, and it's one of those bad things that came along with all the good things that come with Sammamish. That being said, there's some other questions that I have regarding that, and that is, we're talking dollar amounts. So what are we talking about dollar amounts wise to the property owners that are in that area? That's one question. And the other one is, how many property owners did we have back in I think you said 2015, that were not interested in participating in, like easements or, because I don't want to get into where we're going to be fighting over easements. And so, how I'm hoping that this would be something they'd be really interested in doing, because it'd be better for everybody there. And also something that isn't going to hurt their pocketbook. But something, as Councilmember Ritchie said, it would be a good partnership for everybody.
Are you looking for an answer on that? Okay, that's fine. I wasn't sure. So to your first question is kind of how much that would cost. So as part of the Zachus Basin Plan, which I think I'm presenting next week or at a future meeting, we developed a potential project, and it was cited at over $2 million. To like $2 to $3 million for the whole project. Only a small component of that would be the water quality portion. So that would be a very large, probably cost prohibitive assessment on the rest of the owners that they would very likely not agree to. There are other options that staff have been brainstorming for this, including maybe, with the Inglewood trunk line project that we just finished a couple of years ago. We had stub outs going up streets to the north. That could be something that we were looking at, that if we put a stub out up to the north to collect that water and bring it down as part of a larger, Lewis Thompson Road tightline, where we upgraded that project. And that project we did develop as part of the Zachus Basin. That type of project could be in the range of $300,000 to $400,000 for that section of road. And that would, I think, alleviate a lot of the problems that the downstream neighbors at like 208th, 209th are experiencing. Not all, but most. So whatever that breakdown would be of public versus private for that $300,000 to $400,000, I don't have that off the top of my head, but I think it's a lot more palatable, and it would be a lot more feasible. And I think the second question you asked, Deputy Mayor, was back in 2015, 2016, how many property owners were unwilling to sign those easements. I was not working for the city then. I don't have that data right now. I can follow up on it.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, hold on. Great. So one question I have is, when have we taken over private drainage facilities and when haven't we? So obviously not a list of specific examples, but just in general, when do we and when do we not generally take over those?
That's a great question, Council Member. And Tawny might be able to answer a little bit more. My knowledge of it is we do assume maintenance of private drainage facilities when we take over a plat. So a private developer goes and constructs drainage improvements, a pond or a vault, and then they deed it over to the city, so we own it at that point. I don't know if you're aware of any other circumstances.
That was going to be my answer.
Oh.
So following on with that, so if we do that, we aren't just paying a portion of those maintenance costs for the water quality piece. We're paying all of the maintenance costs, correct?
Mm-hmm, that is true.
Okay, just, it says here, right, a clear public benefit will result greater in scope than the public cost from the use of public resources. So when you talk about how, there would be a small portion would be for water quality, it seems to me that that is one area where we can do it, but it seems like this clause here, right, would imply that things like the flooding, right, would be something where potentially the public benefit would be greater than the cost. And that leads me to my next set of questions, which is how much did it cost to repair East Lake Sammamish Parkway when it flooded and broke? Do we have any rough idea of what that cost was?
Are you referring to
Lewis Thompson.
No, I'm sorry, Lewis Thompson,
Lewis
sorry.
Thompson.
You mean when the
sorry.
landslide?
Yeah.
I believe that was about a $1.2 million contract. That was installing a soldier pile wall. If not, maybe Cheryl knows.
Cheryl, do you remember?
I believe it was at least $1.2 million.
Okay, so roughly, so somewhere in the $1 to $1.5 million range. But didn't we also have? I thought we did have a a flooding incident on East Lake Sammamish Parkway where things came down the hill and broke part of the parkway, did we not?
The Nisqually earthquake.
No, that was- I know
Had
that
a
was the-
separate thing.
Was it Zaccoose Creek when it eroded the side, the embankment of the
That's what we're
parkway?
talking about here, though, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's a
Yeah, so how much did it cost to repair? What I'm getting at here is that obviously if this area goes, if we leave it and nothing happens, bad things can happen to public infrastructure that will likely cost us more to repair than it would cost us to prevent in the first place. That's kind of what I'm getting at. So I'm curious if, given that those are potential dangers, can those also be part of the portion that the city could potentially pay, not just the water quality portions?
I'll let Mike answer that one.
Yes, almost surely. I mean, I say almost because we have to actually be able to identify with some reasonable specificity the public benefit to be obtained. But flood prevention certainly would fall within that category.
And then can we quantify the impacts on the water? It's not just a water quality issue, right? But can we quantify the impacts of remediation? Again, if we did nothing, how much would it cost us to have to go in and clear the water that is being damaged by, I mean, you say that only a small portion of that would be attributable to water quality, and I guess I'm struggling with that because I see us spending a lot of money on a lot of projects all over the city trying to make sure that we are trying to save the kokanee and make sure that we aren't negatively impacting water quality in Zaccoose Basin and all the other, Jacobs, all these places, right? So how is it that we only attribute a small portion to the water quality when we spend so much of our resources trying to protect the lake and all of the water that feeds into it?
Again, great question. And it's difficult to put a price on where you value water quality. I don't have this costs 30, obviously to remediate, you could put a price to that, or to test, you could put a price to it. But for degraded water quality or degraded, I don't know of a way to put a number to that.
So let me just add also that when we talk about a specific project in the basin plan where we take the water from private roads in Tamarack and create a project that would reduce the flooding, improve the water quality, that's all in the Tamarack area where the flooding is the problem,
right,
on private property. We have a flooding problem, sheet flow problem at the intersection of 210th Avenue and Lewis Thompson. That has been identified by many occasions by residents and through our basin plan. We have a project that could fix that problem and reduce the flooding in the Tamarack area. That is where we could spend legally our public funds, because it would alleviate the problem on public property, public infrastructure, and potentially provide additional water quality for that area as well.
Because, I mean, for me, right, to make this decision, I think there are a couple of things. I think, and Deputy Mayor Moran kind of touched on this, and you talked a little bit about the history. Tamarack isn't, it's somewhat unique, right, and sort of how it evolved. It is a quote-unquote private neighborhood, but it's never had a developer, right, and it's all been developed by mostly individuals. And so there really hasn't been an opportunity for those individuals to remediate this on their own, right? So for them to have to do this project, if they wanted to get together, they would have to jump through these same hoops, only they wouldn't have the expertise of the city staff to help them figure out what they would need to go do and how they would get all of the permissions and everything like that. So it's unreasonable in my mind to expect that the people living there could remediate this on their own. Right, and certainly the people that live downhill didn't approve the houses being built uphill from them that have exacerbated these issues, or maybe even caused them in the first place, right? So I look at, one, that it's unreasonable to think that they could solve it on their own. I don't even know how they could. And then the second part is when I look at the cost, right? If we're going to go spend money, what is that cost benefit? And when I think about all the potential bad things that could happen if we don't do this, those costs seem far greater than the cost of doing something to prevent it. Because some of the things, like if water continues to run into the lake and it continues to take sediment and other bad things down into the lake, there may not be a dollar figure we can put on that to try to remediate that. And what happens if that is contributing to the demise of the kokanee, right? And a species goes extinct. How do you put a price tag on those things? So that's what I look at, is that, you know, what does that really look like? And then are we really talking about something unreasonable? It doesn't seem unreasonable at all to think that we need to correct that. So thank you.
Councilmember Hornish.
Can I get a restatement of the motion, please?
The motion was to direct staff to create drainage improvements for Tamarack.
Can you repeat that again?
The motion was to direct staff to create drainage improvements for Tamarack.
Okay. I know we have an issue, and we've talked about it for my 3.5 years. Answer one question, there was a comment about us taking over. I think maintenance costs are very different than capital expenditures in my mind. It's, you know, magnitude's different as to what the cost-benefit ratio is for public benefit and everything. So I think capital expenditures should be looked at much more with a high scrutiny under the Constitution, I believe. And I'm really concerned about how you apply the cost benefit and the public benefit versus the private benefit. Having said that, I think we need to do something or look at it for sure. And I know there are citizens that are saying, if you do that, I'm going to create a lot of problems because I've spent my own money, and that's what these people should be doing because it's on private land. So this is a no-win situation for us as council. Having said that, I don't think I can go with the motion as is, but I was wondering, for a follow-up maybe, you kind of talked about with the water quality being the public benefit. Totally agree with that. Is there a way of describing or analyzing and estimating a cost of what it would take, and I think you kind of talked about this, Tawny, at the 210th Lewis Thompson, that we could do this one project that would really benefit the water quality? Is that what you were talking about when you said that would be the project at 210th and Lewis Thompson?
Yeah, that would be it, yeah.
Okay, and that's all on public land, no private benefit or anything. It benefits the people up the hill and it benefits people in Tamarack, but it's not on their land and there's no direct benefit, correct?
It would have to go through an easement dedicated to the city up to 10th and that is private.
But we already have the easement.
We do not.
We have to get the easement,
We do
that's right.
not.
Now I remember, yeah, okay. But we'd have to get that, okay. So we have that cost. Is there something more that we could look at doing on the private land then that would help?
So we at staff, as part of the Zachus Basin Plan, originally looked at the Tamarack Tightline, which is the full kit and caboodle down the hill. And it was this other option of going up to 10th, a smaller project that would address those flooding issues. We haven't done a ton of thinking about it outside of those two ideas.
Okay, well, let me tell you where I'm trying to go, because what I'm thinking in my mind, and to the city attorney's point, is we got to have some reasonable basis for the cost and the public benefit. If we know that the public benefit is to have better water quality and it costs X dollars, but we can do the same thing by going onto the private land and doing a different project and having the same benefit or even greater, and it costs less, why wouldn't we do that? I mean, then we have a very good basis to say, we're doing a great public benefit and it costs less by doing this improvement on public land. I don't think anybody can fault us for that. If we know what it costs to do the public benefit water quality that we're trying to get to, and it costs more by going onto the private property, then that difference is what we need the private owners to pay for to be able to do that grander project versus just a project that we would do only to get the water quality. You see where I'm going to a logic to try to figure out what's public versus private?
And I think it's difficult. I think Tawny mentioned it before that to collect the water, to treat it, it's a lot of water that comes down 2/10. It's a veritable river. To collect that water, we would need to collect it somehow uphill of that.
Before it gets to
the intersection. It'd be very difficult to grade the road in the public right of way to accommodate the same goal as a collection and bring it down.
So let me ask a little bit different question then. What public benefit are we getting by, what's the public benefit we're trying to address? Is it it's the water quality that's coming off of Lewis Thompson out of Tamarack, is that correct?
I think that, and then also the flooding at the public intersection
Okay.
of 210th and Lewis Thompson.
Which could be a public detriment, for sure. I
Right.
mean, it's a safety issue.
The very same issue that we fixed just a couple blocks to the east, yeah, with the wall.
Okay, that caved. Yeah, okay. Well, that's a public right-of-way over there, right? Yeah. But that would be in the same place. It'd be a public right-of-way that would be doing the improvements for the public benefit.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I'm open to trying and doing something, but I think we need to be very delicate and balanced and be very, very careful on how we define the public benefit and have good basis for that. The motion as is to do drainage improvements, I think, is too broad and too direct to go directly into Tamarack and do it, in my mind. So that's good. Thanks.
Councilmember Valderrama?
Yeah, I would support that. It's too broad. I have a question first for council members Ritchie and Moran. When you talk about partnership, are you talking about a local improvement district? Is that what you're talking about as a partnership, and will they play ball?
Go ahead.
I don't have those answers. That's why I'm saying, this is why it's a motion, so that we can have this discussion. I don't have those answers.
Okay.
But I would like to direct staff to find those answers.
Okay.
Can I answer just to clarify, Councilmember, I agree with you, Councilmember Stewart, or Councilmember Valderrama. That open-ended issue is what I was going for with this motion, to create an opportunity for staff, to direct staff specifically to look for what options and alternatives and potential partnerships there may or may not be, and to look at the full area, the full broad spectrum of public and private lands, and to see where we need to crack the door here. That's all I'm trying to do, and I'm intentionally trying to make it broad to give staff the opportunity to go about and find out what those partnerships may or may not be. That's all.
I appreciate it, because there is history here, and council members Hornish and Malchow were with me when we started to address the issue of a local improvement district. It never went out to Tamarack. We did have a handful of people here who were opposed, who said, city, you should pay 100%, I don't want to contribute, which I can understand altruistically if you can get somebody else to pass the buck. Likewise, I should point out that there is a precedent that the city did do this in Pine Lake. Actually, it was with King County, the Pine Lake zone. Councilmember Gerund was one of the people affected. They paid 100% under a local improvement district that took place. So there is a precedent in our cities for 100% being done. That said, the city manager then, Lyman, had done a study to see what is the private versus public potential benefit. As I recall, as we were sitting here, he said, well, with a stretch, we could get to 10%. Others on the council wanted to try to stretch it even further. But he was saying, hey, you know, we're stretched to get to 10%, but maybe we could play a little bit more onto that. So there must be some paperwork back there to justify those numbers that, since this is a discussion, would be good to pull back to us as they were looking at that for a local improvement district, for a partnership that could be done onto it. This is not an isolated case, as we were talking about then, as we had spoken, similar circumstances, not bad on Inglewood, Southeast 24th. There are a number of other streets that were identified. Every one of them will come after the city. So this could very well be a fiscally irresponsible, morally irresponsible. If I was a developer and you do this, why would I put in a stormwater feature? Because you've now set a precedent that the city will come in and put in your stormwater features. Additionally, since we're now talking about Tamarack, Tamarack had a number of unique criteria that came up with it, and many of us, if not all of us, have walked it at some time or another. And as you start to look at that, you'll find when you're going through there, two things that the city found, and it was discussed. Again, there should be paperwork because this was brought forward. First of all, to the discussion point, private property and road owners must maintain the drainage facilities. The city does not maintain conveyance systems on private roads. It was cited then, and if you walk it now, a lot of those culverts on those streets are crushed and filled. They have not been maintaining. There's that compounded. I mean, you can walk it and see it. I think, Christy, you had said on one of your times that you were walking there, as I recall, that they're visible to the eye. Additionally, on Tamarack, as I understood it, and we'd have to go back to talk to linemen or staff, there were a number of people who had put down impervious pavement without permits, and it presents an issue that they've compounded their problem. And what would the city do? Would you have them tear it all up, including structures that have been put in or not? So it becomes more complicated as we start to peel this onion. There is another issue that was raised, and this was raised by actually the then Mayor Gerand, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, when you have water coming downhill, there is the common enemy doctrine, if I recall correctly.
Pretty good, Counselor.
Well, which is saying, hey, if it's coming downhill and you've diverted it because of constructions, those people up top actually are the ones responsible. Well, that's the case here. And in fact, in a number of the letters that we got today, as I was reading it here, they talk about one, Mr. Carlton, but several had talked about this. His house is on 210th Avenue Northeast, built in 2000. He has an expensive vault. So our street has a stormwater problem, which we as homeowners cannot address as the water is flowing from the uphill streets. So the common enemy doctrine, and that was mentioned a few years ago. Well, really, all things considered, you should be taking action against the guys that are uphill who have been causing this problem that's flowing down, not necessarily the city. The city came in a couple of years ago and said, we're going to try to help because this is a big issue. Let's find that portion that is of public benefit to it. I'd like to see the numbers that came out. At that point, he was saying that he could get to 10%. If that's the number, then let's see, analyze that, look at an LID, a local improvement district, put it out and see if there's an appetite for it for the citizens to put up to 90% in this neighborhood, or whatever that number turns out to be as we start to fix the two of them. But this onion, as I said, when you keep peeling it, it gets uglier as we go on to this specific neighborhood. And we have to make sure that we're both fiscally and morally responsible in how we're addressing this. Let's see if I've missed anything else from my memory here. Yeah, I think that's the majority for now. Thank you. I'll be back.
I have no doubt. Councilmember Ross.
Okay, thanks. A lot's been said so far, but a couple points I just wanted to make is, number one is I get concerned about setting policy by precedent, and that this really feels like that. And I'm not sure if we have any policy guidelines associated with this. Just saying, look at a project for one development or area we have no constraints, or how do we select these places? How do we select the areas that we address? If there's no skin in the game, I'm concerned that we may draw a lot of low-risk projects, and that would be cost prohibitive. We'd be shifting from the private to the public sector low-risk projects. So how do we put the fence posts to address the serious problems like Tamarack, Inglewood, but not take over private drainage systems that are low risk? So that's really a rhetorical question. I think we certainly should look at what would take to address the Inglewoods and the Tamarack type areas, but I still think from a process standpoint, we got to think about those consequences.
I have a couple of questions. And first, I mean, I'm certainly supportive of looking for solutions up there. But I do have a question, and I'm assuming that I already know the answer, which is there is not a 100% public benefit associated with what you've identified as being the solution through the Zachuse Basin Plan. Is that correct?
Through the Zacchaeus Basin Plan, there is not a 100% public benefit. With some modification of what we proposed, there could be a greater than 10% allocation of public benefit, potentially.
Okay, but you had also mentioned that's in the $2 to $3 million range. So the cost associated burden for 160 homeowners is, I mean, you might as well not even ask them. I mean, that's not going to go anywhere.
Right.
Now, the proposal that you'd mentioned about a stub out might have some viability at 300 to 400,000, but of course we don't know the breakdown on that either, I think is what you'd stated.
Correct.
Okay. So the 10% number, I don't personally recall that in particular, but even if that was the case, I think that was based on a pre-Zacchaeus Basin plan. And now we have probably and the reason we held on it was to do that basin plan so that we would know what the answer was. And it sounds like you now know what the answer is, and it's a fairly robust and expensive one. I think we all up here appreciate the water quality piece. The public safety component relative to flooding is critical too. I just want to know, there's been some flooding that occurs down at East Lake Sammamish Parkway as well. I know I've walked down there with Miss Wichter before, and there's water kind of seeping out, and that goes across East Lake Sammamish Parkway. Is that going to be captured in this particular project as well?
No, that is actually proposed for a separate project. That's about 100-something thousand and would be completed completely in the public right-of-way.
Okay.
Totally
okay.
separate project.
So that's great. So at least I just wanted to make sure we were getting that. Councilmember Hornish had mentioned the risk of litigation, and I think, in that being if the city assumes the full project, but I don't even think legally we can. If you're saying that there's not 100% public benefit, we can't pay that. We can only pay the portion if we can even identify it, which sounds like a pretty onerous project unto itself. But we have had residents, as Councilmember Valderrama has stated and Councilmember Hornish stated, have done projects on their own property. So there is some risk to the city. So in short, I guess I support having the city look at what those improvements could be, but I think it's got to be based in reality. A $2 to $3 million project is not a reality for the residents in Tamarack. A $300,000 to $400,000 one might be tangible for them, but I suspect that might be a hard sale for 100. Is it just simple majority, 50% plus one? For a lid?
I believe it's 60% actually. It has to be.
That may be a heavy lift in and of itself.
The other issue with an LID is the particular property has to have a benefit to the LID. So there may be areas in Tamarack
so it's not all
that
160.
may be excluded from the 160 total.
Okay.
So that would increase the cost per household.
And that was just a point I was going to make there too, Council, is that in order to get the LID off the ground, I mean, first there has to be either a council resolution or a petition from the owners. But the first step then is to have an appraiser take a look at the properties as the value of the properties with the project and the value of the properties without the project. And if the value of the properties does not increase by more than the cost of the project, the LID is over. It can't go forward. Now, to Christie's point, though, and this is not me attempting to spend the Tamarack property owners' money, but $1.6 million or $1.8 million, if it was spread over 160 properties, $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 each, that's normally payable over 20 years, the life of the LID bonds, and it runs with the property. So if you make your first 8 or 9 payments and then you sell your home, the rest goes to the buyer. So it's still a significant chunk every year, but it's not as if people have to come up with $10,000 or $15,000 all at once.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay. So I guess the long and short of it, I'm not sure that I support the motion the way it was put out there, which was to just direct staff to create drainage improvements.
Do you want to make a friendly amendment?
No, there are no friendly amendments, but I'll make an amendment, which would be to, and I've got to think this one through, and maybe I need our city attorney's help too, which would be to look at the viability of a lid in Tamarack, and maybe that's using the information that you just shared with us here to find out if it's even a viable option for us. And I guess that looks two different ways because it's based on the project and the cost of the project. So that could either be that $300,000 to $400,000 stub you were talking about, or it's the full meal deal of $2 to $3 million for all of it. So I don't know if we look at it through both lenses to find out which one is viable. But if there's not 100% public benefit and we cannot pay by law the full amount, then the property owners are going to have to come to the table with the balance. So we need to understand what the balance is and whether or not the lid will even fly based on what you just told us about their property value based on the project. That was a very long amendment. Hopefully you captured that.
I feel like
Want to
that-
restate it?
So, sure, I'll try. No? Melanie, can you read that back? So the amendment would be to actually direct staff to look at the viability of a lid for our local improvement district for the Tamarack, find out which homes would qualify for it if it's not all 160, and we're just looking at some of them, and then the two options that and maybe there's more options that you've identified, but at least the two that you mentioned here, Danica, which were the stub out and then the full project on Lewis Thompson.
Mayor, I feel like that's not an amendment. I feel like that's a whole separate motion.
It probably is.
And I only say that because I think, not to speak for Councilman Ritchie, but I think his idea was, as Danica stated, they only looked at the most expensive and this one other thing. And she said there's probably a whole array of things in between that they haven't looked at. And so the viability of a lid really depends on the project. And so I think first we need to understand what is the list of potential projects that have value, and then look to your point at the lid, which is why I feel like it's not really an amendment, it's a whole separate motion.
So let me ask staff this. How much time would it take you to look at options other than the stub out and the full project?
We have thought about this project a lot. I think the step out's going to be one of the cheaper, least invasive, and most effective ways, but we can look at this again in maybe a month.
Okay, that's not bad.
I mean,
It's
Make it two.
yeah, the stub out option. The stub out option would be in addition to a tight line down Lewis Thompson. So the Zacus Basin Plan, which you may have seen in draft on the city's website, has an option for a tight line down the entirety of Lewis Thompson Hill Road. And we could do that with a non-motorized project. Paired with that, we could do that coupled with this stub out onto 210th. But the stub out would need a tight line down Lewis Thompson, and that wouldn't be more than $400,000. That's in the $3 to $4 million range for the tight line, similar to Inglewood Hill Road tight line. But that would be the option that would solve the city's existing problems of flooding on Lewis Thompson. And it also would solve some flooding, actually a majority of the flooding on 210th coming from Northeast 4th Street going east-west. And then we could add a water quality treatment option to that as well. So that's the project, that do a stub out on 210th with our tightline project on Lewis Thompson.
Okay. So I guess let me withdraw my amendment and let me state this is what I'm looking for in an ideal situation would be a menu of options that kind of marry up the best of both worlds, which is that we can remedy some of the problems in Tamarack, right, with the water crossing over, public right-of-way, and water quality issues. Hopefully we can resolve some of the flooding issues that private citizens are seeing up on private property. Of course, that's the private, the lid portion of it. But I want to understand what's viable, right? I mean, there's the $3 or $4 million project with the stub out, which may or may not be a viable option. Is there something that we could do now that could tie in with maybe one of those CIP projects that you're going to propose in 2020 that we could look at now. I think I'm looking for
I think that's
something
the motion on the table.
Something, well, but the motion on the table was to direct staff to create drainage improvements for Tamarack. I'm not looking for them to create them.
That's inaccurate.
Okay, that's what I repeated 3 times.
I clarified it.
Ask.
So what is the motion?
Who has the floor right now?
I do.
Okay.
Okay. So I think that's what I'm looking for. We can get to Councilmember Ritchie's motion and vote on that and find out whether or not we need to make additional direction for staff. So there's other people still waiting to speak. So Councilmember Stewart.
So I just want to address one concern is, why would developers do any sort of a drainage project? Well, because they would have to, because our code now would require them to do that. They wouldn't be able to get approval to do it otherwise. I guess a couple of questions I have is how do we address the fact that these private landowners aren't maintaining their ditches? And they're causing harm to the people down the hill from them. I don't think there is a way. So again, we're back to the people have problems and they have no way to resolve them. Is that correct? Okay. And then as to the unpermitted impervious surfaces, I feel like if that is in fact the case, that we as the city have an obligation to go deal with that, especially if they could be causing harm to people downhill. So I don't know what the right action there is, but it feels like we now, if that has been raised, knowledge is responsibility, and we now have a responsibility to go deal with that. As for this common enemy doctrine, again, what does that look like to take action against the people up the hill? And maybe we need an executive session, but what liability might we have as the city if we approve the permitting for those common enemies, so to speak? Because that's where I get concerned. And again, there may be a common good, a public benefit by us addressing the issues so that we aren't liable there.
Yeah, a couple of points. The city has no liability ever for issuing permit decisions. That's called the public duty doctrine. It's pretty well established. It's quite well established in Washington. Here's a quote from one of the Supreme Court cases on it. A local government owes no duty of care to ensure compliance with codes. Permit applicants, builders, and developers are in a better position to prevent harm to a foreseeable plaintiff than our local governments. Moreover, the approval of plans and satisfactory inspections do not absolve a developer from the legal obligation to comply with statutes. So there are a few exceptions called special exceptions to the public duty doctrine, but the act of issuing permits does not ever incur liability for a city. With respect to the common enemy doctrine, well, let's be clear that what it means in plain English, and you guys know how good I am at plain English, it means water has a right to run downhill. So the uphill property owners have a right to let that water off of their property and onto the downhill properties. What they don't have a right to do is artificially divert it. But again, our friends at the Supreme Court have said, among other things, quote, an upland property owner may even hasten or increase the flow of surface water into a drainway. These natural drainways, everybody has a natural easement over downhill properties, so long as the water is not diverted from its natural direction. So water can run downhill. That's what the common enemy doctrine says.
All right. Thank you.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Back to the earlier point, again, here you can walk and see that a number of personal ditches have not been maintained by them, and culverts, as I had mentioned, to the point. So that's a one issue. More importantly, to the motion at large, I'm uncomfortable without it talking about local improvement districts, particularly in Tamarack, because they have a history of trying to latch on to things and think that there is more being insinuated. There isn't, that they understand that we're looking at a partnership and that we are not looking at paying 100% if we're going to do anything at all. And then they also need to look at what's the responsibility of these neighbors uphill that have been diverting the water. And that's something that they were told years ago to start doing, and they haven't done it. I understand it's an uncomfortable position to also be in, but that shouldn't be the city's responsibilities. And it's very dangerous to set a precedent otherwise on this. There is this project, remember, would be paid over 20, 30 years. There is a precedent, which even Don Jurin has been paying for his neighborhood at 100% onto it. So I would like to see local improvement district included into the motion. I'm not sure if you withdrew yours, is that correct, your motion, or is it still?
My amendment, no, I withdrew it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Councilmember Ritchie.
So the intent of my motion initially was to create an opportunity to not have a half an hour conversation where none of us are civil engineers up here. I would hope that we can, the intent of my motion is to give direction, to ask the council to give direction to staff, to civil engineers. You're a civil engineer, I'd assume. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. My hope is that you can give us reasonable options, including LIDs, including ABC, XY, I don't care what options do we have to do what that are in the public right away that are creating private partnerships. I'm asking for you in this motion to be clear, and if I haven't been, I'll restate it or take an amendment, to ask staff to come back to us with drainage improvement options within Tamarack. A full menu, as the mayor said, whatever that looks like, including LIDs, including anything else that you can think of. We have ignored this too long. It's time we deal with it. What can we do? And is there a political cost to doing something? Yes. Is there a political cost to doing nothing? Yes. I agree with the, Councilmember Hornish, sorry. Councilmember Hornish, that this is a politically untenable situation. I agree with that sentiment. So, but I feel like we need to do something. That's the intent of my motion. If that's not clear, I'll withdraw, I'll rewrite, I'll take an amendment, but I'm not trying to exclude anything in this motion. I'm trying to include a broad umbrella to give the staff the opportunity to put in whatever they feel is appropriate so that we as a council can give you our policy direction based upon your professional judgment. Thank you.
Councilmember Ritchie, would you mind if I offered up some language that might be tenable for the council?
Always, please.
Okay.
Yes, let's get done
So
with
what if we direct staff to bring forward potential projects for flooding and water quality for water coming out of the Tamarack neighborhood and to establish the viability for LID for a variety of projects?
Yeah, that's.
I'll support that.
I support it. Does that include, when you hear that, can I clarify? When you hear that, does that mean, do you hear that being LIDs and other options? Do you hear the other options part of that, in that? I just don't want to be limited to one.
But not limited to.
And just may I clarify? Am I allowed to do that? Does that include cost breakdowns as well as an assessment?
I think the variety of projects.
A broad assessment, like
well, if we're going to talk about a lid, you're going to have to find out the cost and then whether or not what our city attorney said about the value of the home before and after the improvement. So there is a cost going to be tethered into those options.
High level though, right? Not the specifics yet.
It doesn't have to be specific, but we have to have an idea of whether or not a lid's going to fly or not.
And trying to get an idea of that public-private cost share, at least the first sweep of that. Okay.
I support the mayor's motion. If that means withdrawing mine, I'll do that. If it means amending whatever's the path of least resistance. Melanie, how can we make this easy for you? I changed my motion to the mayor. It's her. She's much more articulate than me. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Do you have it captured, Melanie? And does council feel comfortable voting at this point?
Second the mayor's motion. Am I allowed to do
Yes,
that?
you can.
It is your motion. It just has to be worded.
You're seconding yourself.
Seconded the motion. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in
Don't vote against yourself.
favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0 passes.
Wow.
Okay. Gotta turn my computer back on now.
Comment
No
on this
good
issue?
deed goes
Go ahead.
unpunished.
There was a policy that was in our agenda bill that was a draft policy. I don't think we're looking to adopt that tonight, but I would implore the council members to look at it. I was reading it. It's really pretty good. I think we had seen it a couple years ago, for those of us that have been sitting up here. I think it addresses and tries to balance and gives flexibility to the staff of how to do what we just asked you to do, frankly. So, but I think we ought to adopt that policy at some point in the future, so don't forget about that.
Okay, so, sorry, my iPad is not working here. Now we have a presentation on the transportation master plans for community outreach. Oh, and I guess we should take this opportunity since Tawny's still up at the dais, if she's listening, to say thank you to Tawny for all of her work and effort here at the City of Sammamish and for her dedication to kokanee and stormwater and water quality here in Sammamish. We really appreciate all you've done for Sammamish. Best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For all that, you can go home early.
A whole 22 minutes.
I'll go to Maple Valley if I can go.
Good job. I like it.
It's just the community outreach. It's not the master plan itself.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, Mayor Malchow and members of the council. My name is Doug McIntyre. I'm a transportation planner with the Department of Public Works, and to my left is Cheryl Paston, acting director. And tonight we're here to talk to the council about our plans for community outreach, specifically focusing on 2019. And we'll get into specifics in a moment. But we do want to cover, again, the outreach plan, specifics on the tools that we're planning to use to engage the community, and then next steps. Our hope today is to get input from City Council on what we're presenting on in terms of the tools we're using, how we're going to be engaging the public, and some of the questions that we're going to be asking the public as well. So before I get into the basics here, I did want to mention that the staff and consultant team did begin outreach back in 2017. So we're not starting from scratch here. We have a pretty good foundation to work from. And again, this will focus on the future, but I don't want to discredit the past outreach that has been completed. And the real culmination of that outreach was the 6 goals identified for the TMP, and that's Exhibit 1 in your packet tonight. So the basics here, we have the what, why, when, who, and how. You'll notice that the where is not here because that is self-evident. But I did want to kind of step through the real important foundational pieces of what we're trying to do tonight with the TMP. So the what, again, council has seen this slide several times in the past, and these are sort of the 3 major pillars of the TMP. What we're trying to accomplish here is identify projects so that we can complete connections for all modes of travel and really get support from the community in really a deep way, and have a fundable and implementable plan at the end of the process. Tonight, we're really focusing on that middle pillar, the supported by the community. We're going to have a really in-depth conversation with the community. We're going to hopefully create public buy-in for what we're trying to do with the projects and our priorities and our approach to the TMP. And then hopefully through this process identify and get real civic champions for implementing this, because after we adopt it, it really is about the implementation of this plan. Now, getting into the why. So why are we reaching out to the community? Well, one, at the beginning of the process, council did direct staff to develop a really robust, comprehensive plan for reaching out to the community to hear about the priorities for the TMP. And so we really want to have real honest discussions on some of the major topics that we're dealing with under the TMP. That includes the walk and bike network, transit opportunities, connectivity, safe routes to school, among many, many other things. And all of that input just directly informs what we're doing to build a draft TMP, but also to identify program and policy updates, as well as getting to the most important part of the TMP, which is the prioritized project list. The win of our outreach plan is, again, focusing on 2019 here, but we have the major component of what we're doing for the in-person meetings is our August workshops, those 3 dots in the middle of the screen there. Those are planned to be 3 of the same type of meeting, but in different sections of the community. So we're going to the north section of the community, the central section of the community, and then the southern section of the community to really get a geographic representation, as well as talk about projects that are near and dear to the community's heart in those specific areas. Rounding out that outreach, and this is actually getting into my next slide a little bit here, but before I do that real quick on this WIN slide is we will have council touch points in September, November, and December that are not listed on here. These are more about the public opportunities. Really important to this is obviously who are we engaging? Who are the targeted stakeholders? And we've really got a pretty robust list here, but it includes, of course, council as the elected officials and our appointed officials, including planning commission. Our diverse community, we have a growing population. We have a very tech-savvy community. We have a senior population. We have lots of families in Sammamish. We want to engage all of them. HOAs are important to Sammamish as they are to most suburban communities, and can help us identify projects in a really direct way as well. School districts obviously are crucial to how we address traffic congestion. We want to talk to the districts themselves, but also the local schools where we know there are traffic problems. Employers, of course, that is a major element of our traffic congestion in terms of commute traffic into and out of the city. And when we speak of employers, we also want to engage the chamber. And of course, we don't do this in a vacuum, so we also want to engage our regional agencies. That includes King County Metro, Sound Transit, PSRC, and then on a broader level, WashDOT, our State Department of Transportation. And then finally, the last bullet, or the last item there is our community groups. So the interest groups, the PTA groups, the faith groups, all the various community groups you can imagine. We want to engage with as many of them as we can because they offer different perspectives that are just as valuable. So now I'll get into the meat of this, and probably what council is most interested in is how are we going to do this? So we've developed a really well-rounded approach to this. We want to do, of course, the in-person meetings, which are foundational to any outreach effort, but we also want to modernize our approach. We want to do a lot of online engagement, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a second. We also want to do some innovative things like meeting in a box. We're doing some of the groundwork in terms of pop-up events and tabling at different community events. And then we want to verify all that through a statistically valid survey, which will help us really understand what we're hearing from the community. So I'll step through these one by one, and the statistically valid survey will really provide us with a level of confidence in understanding what the public is telling us. In order to do that, we have to work with a firm that is specialized in doing a statistically valid survey. As you're probably aware, they are very strict in how they are done and how the questions are formulated. They are very formulaic in a sense to get the level of confidence that you need. But that, I think, is a really critical component to all of this. It gives us an ability to say things with confidence and not sort of guess on the qualitative nature of things. The thing I'm actually most excited about is our online engagement effort here. And this might be news to the city, but we are currently working on building what's called an Engagement HQ platform. So that's a relatively new two-way communication platform, and we're calling ours Connect Sammamish. And it really is about modernizing how we engage with the community. The website is mobile friendly, so it really, again, reduces barriers for people to participate. If you can't carve out 2 or 3 hours on a weeknight, you can participate online. That broadens our reach without a whole lot of extra effort. And a bonus to this is that we can actually use Google Translation into it, so it reduces the language barriers as well. We know it's not perfect, but it helps to, again, just reduce barriers in any way that we can. But we're currently building that out. We hope to have it live by the end of the month, and definitely before our workshops. In-person meetings, I've touched on this earlier, but heavily focused on our workshops in August. But that doesn't mean that we're not doing other in-person meetings. So actually, I'm already meeting with folks who have reached out to me, representatives of HOAs, small groups, really anybody who wants to meet with me in person. I will go meet them where they are to talk. This is really crucial to how we build relationships with our community. I think that in order for us to have some of the really tough conversations that we're going to have under the TMP, we have to first have a really strong relationship. And the in-person meetings are the best way to build those. I think that, again, using a variety of methods within this category will help us get a better understanding of the community's desires. Meeting in a box, I did mention this at one of our earlier meetings, I believe back in April. This is sort of a new tool that I've used in the past, and I really like it. So the idea behind this is that staff creates a literal box that has everything somebody would need to run a meeting and get input from their faith groups or community groups or anything, really friends or family even. So staff puts the effort into building the box. It has everything, and it's essentially a one-stop shop. A member of the community can ask to pick it up and go to their, say, HOA annual meeting, run the meeting, get input, and then return it to the city. And I found that the input that you get through this effort is actually the same that you get in a workshop, and it really reduces the resource intensiveness of running workshops. So this is sort of to help us round out and be a little bit more cost effective in that way. And then, of course, our pop-up events, which I believe council members have seen in the past at either the farmers market or one of the various community events we have, Party on the Platte, National Night Out, that kind of thing. I like this icon on the top right because it's somebody yelling into a megaphone or something of that nature, and it kind of sort of feels like that in a way. So, you know, you'll set up a table at an event where people already are. The idea there is to come to people and not have people come to you. We'll have exercises, we'll ask questions, we'll have handouts, we'll have all kinds of information about the project. And it's a good way to engage the community, again, where they already are. So another layer to the how we're doing this is really how we ask the questions. I firmly believe that a well-framed question or set of questions is essential to outreach. So you'll notice in this graphic, which is also posted on our webpage, we have 4 of the main questions for the TMP, and they relate to the goals that we've identified, but we've added in 2 extra because we felt like 4 was good for a handout, and 6 is really the full spectrum of questions we have there. But we do want to get the community thinking about how does the city prioritize projects to get a connected road network, to reduce congestion, to increase safety. How does the city improve and enhance the pedestrian and bike network? We know there's gaps. Help us understand those gaps. Help us identify those gaps. And then 3 down on the bottom left, how should the city work with community partners to better alleviate traffic congestion issues around our schools? Again, all of us here know that that is a problem in our community. And then the 4th question on the bottom right is how should the roadway and trail network enhance the character of our neighborhoods? That was something that was definitely brought up by our community in the first phase of our outreach. And then 5 and 6 on the right-hand side there, what type of investments would make transit a more convenient option for you? And then the final question is how should the city leverage partnerships to address regional transportation issues? Again, that's sort of our focus for how we're framing up our conversations with the community. And then this graphic here is really meant to focus on the prioritization of projects. I mentioned that being one of the foundational parts of the TMP. So there will be a lot of community input on this, and specifically in the August workshops, this is going to be a major focus of that. But the idea here is that staff and the consultant team have looked at all of our sources of projects, whether that's the comp plan or the pro plan or any of the variety of plans that we have, gathered all those projects, put them into one spot, developed a way to look at them across the board and start to screen them and see what are the projects that really we can move forward on, because we're identifying quite a bit of projects. We're at about 170 now. We want to get a really good list that really represents what we want to do, and then in the outreach in the workshop specifically, get the community's input on that list and how they feel about the priorities that are emerging from that list, and also identify projects that we definitely don't want to do or that we haven't thought of. So getting that from the community is just as important. And then, of course, as that progresses through the process of the TMP, we'll then look at funding constraints and then eventually come to a prioritized project list.
Doug, I have a quick question.
Yes, absolutely.
The 170 projects that you just said,
Yeah.
Are those identified on the city's website under the TMP, or those aren't living there yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
We want to whittle it down to a more realistic set of projects before we release it to the public, and really the August workshops will be sort of the unveiling of that.
Deputy Mayor Moreno has a question, apparently.
Can I ask how you came up with the August month for doing the workshops? Because that seems to be the month where everybody's gone.
Yeah, part of it is the timing of the project, but part of it is that we didn't want to do September. We felt that that was actually a more busy time for families, and that would be less result in less turnout, people getting ready for school, that kind of thing. September tends to be a bad month to hold outreach. We weren't ready to do it in May or June. It was too early. July is not the best month either, again, because of vacations. And as you get further into the year, there's other priorities that the city is working on that really left us with August. We do recognize that it's not perfect. Ideally, it would be, say, March or April, but with the timing of this project, the way that we were able to address it, August was the best month for us.
Would it be, would it really mess you up to do one in August and one in September and one in October or anything like that?
We could look at that. We've started scheduling meetings and venues, but we could certainly look into.
We certainly could. The schedule's really tight as it is.
Right.
Let us take a look at that.
Because I know
we have
August, I love August here for me because everybody's gone. And there's no line at the grocery store, there's no line anywhere. But that makes it kind of bad for input.
Right. If you remember the earlier slide that he had with the schedule, we will have that online presence for quite a while.
Essentially for the entire project.
Right,
yeah.
for quite, I know that's not the same as doing in person, but we are trying to maximize the opportunities out there. And like you said, we'll take a look at when we can do those public workshops, but we need to get this list of projects in front of you so that you have plenty of time to look at it, talk about it, because we'll want to talk about each one of them and how they came out in the prioritization. And I know you'll be very interested, not only in them individually, but then in combination as well, because they'll have different effects. So we want to make sure that you as the council have enough time to look at that piece of it, much less all the other information that's coming out of the TMP. Our goal is to incorporate this into the comp plan by the end of next year. And that legislative review takes a fair amount of time as well.
Can I make a suggestion on that end where everyone's gone in August? So obviously not everyone's gone, but there are a lot of people gone. Is it possible that the city could advertise these meetings in a box at National Night Out, which happens very early, and you have a lot of homeowners associations coming in to participate in that? Because then you can have HOA people run those meetings instead of extending the timeline out.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We are actually planned to be at National Night Out, so that's one of our tabling events. So
bring your box, literally. Here's the
We'll have a
box,
couple
and
of them
here's
set
how
up,
you get the box.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you for that. Great. And one thing I'll add to this that Cheryl reminded me of is when we hold the workshops in August, we're going to mirror that online. So the questions and the way that people can provide input should hopefully be the same online, so that if you do miss a meeting, you'll still have an opportunity to participate. And to be fair, anytime anybody sends an email or a comment letter to me, I put it in the record right away. It's at any time, if anybody has anything, we can work with that. So.
Perfect.
Okay. So my final slide here, really just high-level recap of where we're headed. We've sort of touched on most of this, but again, identifying and evaluating that draft proposed project list, that's what we're doing right now. We've been working on it for a couple months now. Going into the public outreach, again, happening in August, and we'll have follow-up meetings and such all the way taking us through October. We will then review the public input, refine the list, and start developing the draft TMP at that point at the end of the year, and hopefully have a draft sometime in early 2020. And at that point, once the calendar rolls over to 2020, we'll kind of be shifting our outreach. It'll be more about open houses. It'll be more informational. It'll be less about getting the input. So that's why 2019 is pretty critical to this project. And then to Cheryl's last point, we will incorporate the TMP into the comp plan by the end of 2020. So with that, if council has any feedback, I'd be more than willing to hear.
I really appreciate how robust all of the options are for reaching out to the public. I think that's great. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't have any more questions, but I'm going to need a motion to extend.
Aren't we done?
No,
Darn it.
Extend. 20 minutes. No, 10, 20.
Second.
10 minutes.
He said 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
Doesn't mean we have to go 20 minutes. It just covers
10:20.
us. Okay.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of extending for 20 minutes, which
Aye.
is 10:20. Aye. Okay. All opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, we're extended. Okay, I'm not going to read anything on my council report. It's there. Councilmember Ross, did you want to hit anything in yours or read it at
No, it's there to
leisure?
read.
Great. Anyone else for the council report? Councilmember Ritchie?
Very, very briefly, and this is relatively recently, or I would have included in my report. I just want to read a very, very brief letter I received from a student at Beaver Lake Middle School, Cohen Swanson. He is discussing the fireworks ban in our city. And very briefly, my name is Cohen Swanson. I live in Sammamish, Washington. I'm an 8th grader at Beaver Lake Middle School. For my school project, I had to write to somebody to change something I care about. I'm writing to you about the law against setting off fireworks. I'm writing to ask you to present this to the Sammamish City Council to change the ban on fireworks in the city of Sammamish. Before Klahani was annexed into Sammamish, our neighborhood would celebrate 4th of July setting off fireworks. Everyone had a great time watching the display of colors. However, when we became part of Sammamish on the 4th of July, our neighborhood has not been as alive. What I am trying to say is that everything was fine before, so it can be like that again if this idea gets approved. I appreciate you reading this, and I hope that you send me a response, if possible, to bring back the reason that most people are happy to celebrate this holiday. Thank you for your time and considering this request. Cohen Swanson. So, Cohen, if you're watching, I want you to know that I did read your letter. I definitely, living also in Klahani, we definitely had some pretty serious fireworks before we were incorporated, and this is where I have to be a dad. It is definitely safer to let the professionals set off fireworks. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. And when I was 13, 14 years old, I was the crazy kid that was lighting them off too. But we're trying to be safe, and we're all trying to look out for our kids. So sorry, we're not going to have any more fireworks being let off in the sidewalks. And come to the fireworks on the plateau on the 4th. Well, it'll be fun. So thank you.
Have your mom and dad take you out of
Yes.
town.
There you go. Thank you for the indulgence, council.
Okay.
Thank you, Council.
Councilmember Valderrama.
I have, hopefully quickly, Eastside Fire and Rescue has 2 major issues coming up to address. We didn't have a quorum at the last meeting, and the 2 major issues that are coming up that all the partners should be aware of is, 1, the PFAS studies, next phase is coming out and the implications on that. Second is the issue of the nonprofit. The nonprofit associates coming back up again, that we're going to have to be looking at that. A reminder that Sammamish, at the time of the interlocal agreement approval, had said that council had said that it was going to approve it, just for some history's sake on it. It was delayed because there were some legal questions to be addressed as far as pensions, and that apparently they're coming back now because there's some necessity to change the structure but keep the ILA in place. And so those discussions will be going forward for the next couple of months.
Okay, Councilmember Hornish.
I've got a new matter. I can defer till after the city manager report, if we could add that.
Okay. Are there any other council reports? Okay. Mr. City Manager.
I'm good.
Okay.
So
Councilmember Hornish, you're back up.
All right, so I've been doing a lot of thinking and kind of looking at, I know our staff is dwindling and everything, and I'm trying to figure out what maybe we can do as council. In that regard, I know committee meetings take a lot of staff time and everything, so I am going to move that we dissolve all council ad hoc and standing council committees and or subcommittees. That would not include the external boards or commissions that anybody's serving on. But primarily, the reason is for staff timing and saving timing for staff. And I think with the load we've been seeing lately, we have time to do that as a city council as a whole. And in the past, with a little bit of lack of clarity of what committees are supposed to be doing, I just think it'd be a good move to do away with committees and have the council do everything.
Point of order, I think we've addressed this issue and voted on this issue in the past.
I don't recall if we have.
I believe so, and I'm seeing some nods from council members. Because I know specifically I raised the issues that not only has
If I
every
could, with the floor, it is in our council procedure, so I mean, it's something we adopted over a year and a half ago, and it's a motion to change what our standing committees are under our rules of procedures. I'm done now.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor. It would need a second to be debated.
I'll second it.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, in the past, we have discussed the issues. We've even done some reductions and found that the workload was too heavy for the council. That's the whole purpose, is to make it easier both for staff and for the council to have these commissions. In fact, in the past, councils have mandated the council members have to be on committees because it was too much of a burden when council members were not participating. We had one council where 2 council members did not participate, and so that had become a significant burden. So I think that the unintended consequence you're going to find out is that things that get streamlined, whether it's in the finance committee or legislative, all come here, and we're going to spend more study hours, all of us attending, than if we had. So I'm opposed to this.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, I think it's wholly inefficient to think that we would address every issue as a committee of the whole. I think that committees, when they're run effectively, can do a lot of work. I haven't heard anything. I would love to hear if the city manager is asking for this, if the staff feels overburdened by the committees, if your premise is that we're doing this to save staff time, I'd like to hear from the city manager that this is in fact an issue and that he would like to see us do this. Otherwise, I don't think this is worth discussing.
Thank you, Councilor, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council. This is a surprise for me. And I don't know, I can't speak for staff at this point. I mean, I've never had discussions with staff about dissolving committees. In my experience, commissioners, supervisors, counselors are on a number of committees for a number of reasons. However, maybe we should discuss this at another time.
I agree.
Mean, Councilor Hornish, if this would be acceptable to you, we could bring it up as its own separate agenda item, and we can discuss if this is something we really want to do. I can get staff input. I can just make some notes if staff would like to see this. I don't recommend having more study sessions at night. I think it's taxing on everybody. We try to make things more efficient at night, with the council and that. But if it's acceptable to you, I'd like to maybe move this to a separate agenda item where we can actually discuss it, and we could possibly do it after the break in August, if that's acceptable to you.
Mr. City Manager, if you can pull your light off, it helps
thank
me
you.
see who's next. Thank you. Sorry.
Gun.
Councilmember Ritchie.
I'm going to ask 2 questions. Number one, I think the only committees we have up and operational right now are public safety, legislative, and finance. Is that correct? Okay. So communications and finance meet infrequently. Legislative is more frequently. And what am I missing? Public safety. So public safety, communications, and finance meet quarterly-ish, and legislative is, so I guess I'm not quite sure whether I'd support it or not. I'm not going to say that, but I guess I would prefer to this point and say I'd like to hear a question or the answer to that question from Councilmember Hornish as to whether or not he'd be willing to table this for a future date while we discuss it, because it is 10:20 or 10:07.
Deputy Mayor Moran.
I've said this before. I don't think the committees work. We get stuff from the committees, and they end up where staff has gone to the committees, and then they have to come back to the council and review everything with the council, because nobody wants to listen to the stuff that comes from the committees. So really, all the staff's doing is going through it twice. So, and now there's like all this inner bickering and stuff that comes back out of committee. So I'm all for dissolving the committees.
Councilmember Hornish.
I might be open to delaying, but I'm more of the mindset that right now our committees are dysfunctional and are being abused, so I'd rather do away with them now.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Since Councilmember Hornish isn't on our committees. I don't know how he knows that they're dysfunctional to begin with. Second of all, I think it's irresponsible to bring this up at 10 o'clock at night, and it's surprising both, not just the council, but staff, and that I think we should table this and discuss it in a more thorough way, and also bring up past history of the city and presidents of why the councils have been established and have working. And if he can find a way to make it work more effective without them, I think all of us would prefer to do less time, but I think we're going to find the reverse here, and we're going to continue to add more activities to a council that, as our past city manager says, does paltry at most. Thank you.
Councilmember Ross? Oh, sorry, you turned your light off. Did you want to speak?
Oh, I'll speak. I am concerned about the committees because every committee I've attended has been a repeat what we review in committee gets reviewed with council. And so I really think there's a efficiency gained by having one stop on these key issues. That's the first premise. The other premise is the composition of committees has not also represented the will of the council. So we end up getting some misdirection or direction that may not be captured well the first time by the entire council, and we'd have the positive deliberation. I think it's an opportunity for the council to become more cohesive. I think splitting off in committees has not been helpful for this council. So for those reasons, I do support Councilmember Hornish's motion.
Deputy Mayor Moran.
I just wanted to point out that Issaquah has just done away with their committees. And so, I think there's something to be said for cities that, have found the committees just don't work for them.
I haven't had a chance to speak yet, so I'm going to jump in here before I go to the lights. I think I'd be supportive of at least taking a deeper dive into this, maybe at a later time when it's not this hour. But I do appreciate the sentiments that Councilmember Ross has explained, and I think there is potentially opportunity. I know I had talked to Mary Lou Pauley about, they're just doing committee of the whole, and for maybe, I don't know what their rationale was in moving to that, but I certainly think it could work, and then we're not duplicating efforts and staff time as well, potentially. But I think it might be better if we have a broader discussion on what it looks like and the timing of when that committee of the whole might be. So
put it up for next week.
Oh, yeah, right.
I don't know. I mean, I think as long as it's on the agenda.
We've only got a couple weeks left before the break, so let's do it September.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I think that modeling after Issaquah, I think weren't they the council that just had the article written about them being incredibly dysfunctional? So I'm not sure that they should be the model that we're looking to mimic. But I do think, Councilmember Hornish, I appreciate your concern, but yeah, I think we need to dive deeper. You don't participate in any of the committees, and so it is interesting that you say that they aren't run efficiently. And I'm not sure how in fact, you do know that. So I would like to hear from the staff in terms of what they think will work better. And as opposed to just saying, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater, allowing them to come back to maybe provide suggestions on how we can make it work better. I think that makes a whole lot more sense.
Councilmember Ritchie.
I'm not sure if this is in order or not, but I would like to ask that we table this motion to a date certain in September so that we do not continue to have this conversation at 10:11 at night. I appreciate the sentiment. There are problems with the committees. I just think we should pause here. So I would ask that we table the motion. Is that in order when there's an open?
Yep, I would second that.
Third.
Okay, tabling the motion to September has been moved and seconded, but we have we have a motion on the floor, though, and I don't think your motion supersedes.
That's what I was asking.
To amend it. You're making an amendment.
No, his supersedes mine.
Does it? Okay.
I
Okay,
wasn't
so
sure.
all those in favor of tabling to September, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. Councilmember Ross, was that you or nay?
Nay.
Okay, so we are not tabling it to September. So we are back to
Original motion.
the original motion on the floor. Deputy Mayor Moran?
I don't see what tabling does. This is the same conversation we have time after time after time after time. I haven't heard anything different. It's the same thing. So whether we bring it up next week or we bring it up in September, it's the same thing. So call for the vote.
I do have a question for the city manager. I was looking at the long-term calendar. Next Tuesday has a joint study session with the water districts, and my understanding from talking with the water districts is that that's not actually that they can commit to that.
Don't we have a motion on the table?
I'm confused. We're not tabling it, right? We're voting.
We're not, but I may make an amendment, so
got it.
I'm trying to understand next week. That's all you have on the agenda, and a discussion of the Zacchaeus Basin plan. And if that's the case, then I would make an amendment that we table this till Tuesday, July 9th, to have this discussion.
Second.
Okay, the amendment has been moved and seconded. We'll now vote on the amendment, which is to table this till next Tuesday. If further discussion, Councilmember Valderrama.
Just a quick comment that if you want to look at Issaquah, you better look at the history of Issaquah.
If this is on the amendment that's on the floor, which is on the date for July 2nd.
Yeah. So they've had that problem already and come back.
Okay, this is not relative to the amendment, which is July 9th. Okay, Councilmember Ross. Okay, Councilmember Hornish.
So is that a special meeting, or we'll have to call it a special meeting?
We would have to call it, well, we could just.
It's a study session, Counselor. It's our normal study session.
There's another meeting.
We could make it into a special meeting so we can take action.
We could.
To make it into a special meeting,
If we
yes.
do that, okay, that would be part of the amendment, or
Could you add that
part
to
of the
amendment?
Okay,
motion. All right.
yes, the amendment could be to turn that meeting then into a special meeting. Okay, so we're now voting on the amendment, which is to add this discussion to the July 9th meeting and make that a special meeting.
Wait, I think Rick has an issue.
Hold on.
Okay.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Okay, I think that was 4-3.
Want to try again?
So we will,
Do hands?
I heard 3 on the nay. Is someone changing their vote? Because you can't after we vote.
That's why I'm asking if we should do hands.
Yeah, who voted nay?
I'm a naysayer.
Yeah, there's 3.
Okay, so it is 4-3. The motion passes. We will be discussing this at a special meeting on July 9th.
Hold on, one
We're
minute.
not, we haven't adjourned
My
yet.
suggestion, so have the discussion, go ahead and take a vote on what you want to do with the committees, reject them or keep them. If they are rejected or abolished, then the direction to Rick would be to bring back an amendment to your council rules of procedure resolution on the 16th that eliminates them. If the vote's to keep them, then you're done. So,
We good?
I would bring forth an amendment then, because otherwise, why are we discussing it if we're not going to amend our council rules next week?
well, because it may fail.
It may, but.
Yeah, right. And then if it does, there's no change to the council
I'm
rules.
really confused. Are you saying we should take the vote now and then? decide?
No, on Tuesday at the
okay.
study session.
Oh, okay.
So you can note it
On
as
the
a special
16th.
Okay, if
Okay,
you
I
want,
gotcha.
or keep it as a study session and just make the direction.
Oh, I got you.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Okay.
next Tuesday.
Now I got you.
So the direction, if the direction is consensus is on the study session, if it's not it's not a special meeting, study session says this is the way we want to go based on a consensus of the council. And on the 16th, I know we're extremely busy on the 16th, but we can take 5 minutes and put it on for council vote, because then if the consensus is to abolish, I need to amend.
Your council
Council
rules.
rules.
We'll just put it
Council
on
rules.
consent agenda on the 16th,
we'll put it on
based on
consent.
your discussion next week.
Yeah.
If the
It's
discussion,
going to be that clear at a study session.
Yeah, I'm not sure it will be either. I think a special.
I'd suggest you keep it as a special
I think.
meeting.
Hold on.
Special meeting. That was the direction we gave, was a special meeting. So it needs to be a special meeting.
Fine.
We have a,
Okay, Councilmember Stewart.
yeah, so on the long-term agenda, there's a legislative update on the 16th. I guess maybe we have to wait and see what happens, but we have a very functional legislative committee meeting scheduled to be able to pull together the information to bring forth to the council, which we discussed previously, of how we want to collect all of your input for the lobbyists. So I don't think that the 16th timing actually works out, because we had scheduled from our last meeting to meet with the lobbyists to pull together that information to bring forward to the council after on the 18th. So
When is your meeting?
on the 18th, which is 2 days after the council meeting. So we aren't going to have the information on the 16th. I don't know how it got scheduled on the 16th, but that didn't align with our last legislative committee meeting, which we
So you're saying
give you a report out.
the item here that's on the 16th was a lobbyist update 2020 legislative priorities needs to be pulled off of this.
Correct.
Because your
We need to
meeting is
push it
not
out.
till after.
Right.
Okay, that's fine.
Pull that off.
Okay.
And we had, in my council report, we put the timing down so we can.
We're going to move it, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I just want to make sure that that gets moved. And if we abolish the committee, then I guess you guys can figure out how to get something on the agenda.
Well, we have to have more study sessions.
Okay, we need a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we are adjourned.